The lye water hit the stone with a soft splash that sounded too gentle for what it did. Elena Marisol Alvarez's hands were already raw, the skin on her knuckles split open like old paper, and the brush handle was slick with a mix of soap and blood. She pressed the bristles down anyway, and scrubbed harder because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant making a sound she couldn't afford to make. The church steps were cold, even in summer, the stone sweating with the night's leftover chill. Above her, the adobe walls of Nuestra Señora de los Dolores rose pale and stern in the first gray light. The bell tower cut into the sky like a finger pointing upward, accusing patient, certain. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the last row of houses. A mule brayed down by the acequia. The town was still asleep, but the work Elena did could never wait for daylight. The work belonged to the hours before anyone's eyes were fully open, before anyone could pretend to see her and still claim innocence. Her knees ached deep in the bone. Not the ache of labor, not the ache of age, an ache that felt like it had been planted inside her years ago and watered nightly until it grew roots. She dipped the brush into the bucket again. The lye stung through the cracks in her skin so sharply, her vision went white at the edges. Her throat tightened. She pressed her bleeding knuckles against her mouth hard enough to taste iron and swallowed whatever wanted to rise. It wasn't just pain. Pain was familiar. Pain could be predicted. Pain had a pattern. What she feared was the sound that sometimes slipped out of her anyway, the thin, crushed breath that didn't quite become a cry. The sound that made heads turn. The sound that opened questions. Questions were dangerous. Behind her, the chapel door opened with a slow, wooden groan. Elena's shoulders locked in place. The brush kept moving back and forth, because her body knew how to act, even when her mind went empty. Footsteps crossed the threshold. A man's boots, heavy measured, came down onto the top step and paused. She didn't look up. Looking up was invitation. Looking up meant being seen as a person. Obedience is grace, Padre Tomás Villarreal said, as if he were reciting scripture to the morning air. His voice was calm and rich, the kind that filled space without raising itself, the kind that made people feel safe, just by hearing it. In the town, they called it a gift. They said it carried God in it. Elena kept scrubbing. The stone beneath her brush came clean in streaks brighter than the rest, like scar tissue. Doña Isidora says you left soap scum on the lower step last Sunday, he continued. Deacon Herrera nearly slipped. Yes, Father, Elena said. She was careful with the words. Soft, flat, respectful. She had learned to make her voice small enough to fit inside a prayer. You will do it properly this time. Yes, Father. A pause. She could feel him behind her, his shadow on the stone like a hand laid across her back. Grace does not make a girl afraid to sit down, she thought, but she did not think it too loudly. Even thoughts could become expressions. Even expressions could be punished. The door creaked again. Another set of footsteps came to the landing. Lighter steps controlled as if they belonged to someone who didn't want to leave marks. Doña Isidora Villarreal's presence was colder than the lie. Elena, she said, her voice clipped and clean. Wring the rag out better. I don't want puddles. People notice puddles. Elena's fingers tightened around the brush handle. Yes, ma'am. Isidora exhaled through her nose like she'd smelled something sour. Look at you. Knees soaked through already. You'll leave a trail across my kitchen floor. Elena didn't answer. There was no safe answer. Padre Tomás stepped down a single stair. The stone groaned beneath his weight. His boots were polished even before sunrise. You will come straight to the kitchen when you are finished, he said. There is bread to knead. Yes, father. The two of them stood above her, the way hawks stood above field mice, still watchful, patient. Elena scrubbed until the bristles bent. The lye water sloshed against the bucket rim, and a drop splattered onto her shin. The sting made her breath catch. For half a heartbeat, the dangerous sound hovered in her throat. She swallowed it. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth again harder. The iron taste steadied her a crude anchor. That, Isadora said softly, and Elena knew she was smiling without looking. That little noise. Don't do that in God's house. Folks will be here soon. Elena kept her eyes on the stone. The step was clean now, but she scrubbed anyway until it looked like it had never been walked on. The chapel door shut. The footsteps retreated inside. The morning air returned thin and cool, but Elena's skin stayed hot with the memory of being watched. She scrubbed until the light lifted from gray to pale gold. She scrubbed until the lye burned through the wraps on her hands. She scrubbed until she could imagine, just for a moment, that she was wearing the stone down enough to disappear into it. When the first families started arriving, she gathered the bucket and brush and moved around the side of the church where the shadows clung longer. Women in cotton skirts and shawls stepped carefully up the clean stairs. Men held their hats against their chests and nodded to one another. Children ran ahead, laughing, the sound bright and careless as water. Elena kept to the back. She always kept to the back. Near the corner of the building, Señora Jacinta Romero stood with a woven basket on her hip, eggs in the basket, a tightness in her posture that told Elena she'd learned the same lessons: keep your softness hidden, keep your attention sharp. Jacinta's eyes found Elena and held. Not the way the others looked, with judgment or dismissal. The way a person looks when something isn't right, but saying so might cost her everything. You look thin, Jacinta said quietly, as Elena tried to pass. I'm fine, Señora. Jacinta's jaw clenched. You're limping. Twisted my ankle, Elena replied, quick as a reflex. Lies were like prayers in Arroyo Seco crossing. Everyone recited them together. On the back step. Jacinta's gaze moved to Elena's hands, to the linen wraps already blooming red. Your mother was my friend, she said. You know that. Elena's throat tightened. Her mother's name was a door she couldn't open without letting everything rush out. I know, Elena whispered. Jacinta's lips parted, as if she meant to say something else, offer help, ask questions, create trouble on purpose. Then her eyes flicked toward the church door. Toward where Isadora would be standing in a moment. Toward the way the town listened. Jacinta lowered her voice even more. If you ever have a need, I don't, Elena cut in too fast. Her heart hammered. Need was a word that could be used against her. Need made her sound ungrateful. Need was an admission. Jacinta's eyes hardened, not with anger, with old sorrow. All right, she said. All right, Niña. Elena slipped past her before either of them could say more. Inside the chapel smelled of candle wax and dust and the faint sweetness of dried sage someone had tucked behind the altar. Padre Tomas stood at the pulpit in his black cassock, silver cross gleaming at his throat. He looked carved out of certainty. He had built this church the town liked to remind itself. He had organized the men to haul adobe bricks, rallied the women to cook, for the workers prayed over every birth and buried every death. His hands had blessed the town into existence. That was what they said. Elena slid into the last pew, lowering herself as carefully as possible. The wood was hard and unforgiving. When her body met it, a sharp pain shot through her hip. She inhaled too quickly. A sound escaped her, not loud, not a cry, just that crushed breath like air squeezed from a place that didn't have enough left. Two women in the pew ahead turned their heads. Sister Luce lifted her eyebrows. "You all right back there?" she mouthed. Elena nodded once too sharply. "Yes," she whispered and forced her face into stillness. Stillness was safety. Stillness was obedience. Padre Tomas began to speak. His voice rolled over the congregation like warm river water. Words about submission, about humility, about the strength of a quiet soul. Heads bowed, hands folded. Elena kept her eyes on her lap. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. The wraps on her knuckles were damp. Outside the chapel doors in the brightening morning, a man stood in the shadow of a blacksmith's awning. Mateo Cruz hadn't meant to come to town so early. He'd come for chain links and a sack of flour before the sun climbed high, and the plaza filled with talk. He liked the hours when the town was still half asleep and didn't have enough energy to ask him why he lived alone, why he didn't sit in their pews, why he spoke so little. He'd been standing by his forge checking the tack hanging on a nail when he heard it. The small, airless sound from inside the chapel. It stopped him the way a rifle shot stops a deer. Not because it was loud, because it was familiar. He knew that sound. He'd heard it the night his wife's fever broke, and her skin went cold instead of warm. He'd heard it once from his daughter Lucia when she tried to be brave and failed for a second. He'd buried that sound with them under cedar trees and dirt and silence. Now it came from a girl in the back pew, a girl he'd seen scrubbing steps at dawn, moving like her bones remembered something. Her mouth refused. Mateo's hands, stained black from iron, tightened at his sides. He didn't go inside. He didn't step forward, but he didn't leave. When the service ended, the congregation spilled into the plaza in a slow stream of greetings and gossip. Elena moved toward the back kitchen carrying a tray of chipped cups and plates. The women clustered around the long table laughing too loudly, talking about crops and weather and who'd gained weight. "Elena's been dragging her feet again," one woman said. "Like she's carrying the cross herself." "She's lucky Padre Tomas took her in," another replied. "Some girls don't know how good they have it." Jacinta Romero set her cup down a little too hard. "She's 19, she said, "and she moves like she's 60. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" A brief silence. Then Sister Luce waved a hand. "Some girls are just made fragile." Fragile, Elena thought as she stacked plates by the basin. Fragile was what they called a thing after they'd already broken it. She bent to reach a cup, and her body seized. Pain flared, and she froze, breath locked behind her teeth. The world narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat and the scrape of a plate against porcelain. A shadow fell across the ground. Elena looked up. Mateo Cruz stood 3 paces away, a feed sack over one shoulder, his face unreadable. His eyes were dark and steady, not kind in the way the town used kindness, sweet, performative, conditional. His gaze didn't slide past her. It stayed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. He set it on the ground between them like an offering he didn't expect her to accept. "What's that?" Elena asked, her voice barely working. "Salve," he said. His voice sounded rough, unused. "Pine. For burns. I don't need." He lifted his shoulders slightly, not a shrug, more a statement. "Didn't say you did." He picked up his sack again, turned and walked away without waiting for her answer. Elena stared at the tin until the sunlight warmed it. Something tightened in her chest, sharp and confusing fear, anger, longing she didn't know. Help always came with a price in Arroyo Seco crossing. Mercy came with obedience. Tolerance came with silence. Even Jacinta's concern came with caution, her words bitten off before they became dangerous. But this man had placed something down and walked away as if kindness could exist without ownership. Her fingers moved before she could stop them. She slipped the tin into her apron pocket and went back to the dishes, hands steady, breath shallow. That night in the attic room above the Villarreal house, Elena sat on the edge of her cot and listened to the sounds below the clink of Isidora's jewelry as she undressed the scrape of Padre Tomas's chair in his study, the low murmur of his voice rehearsing tomorrow's words. She opened the tin. The smell of pine rose up sharp and clean. She dabbed a little onto her knuckles. The sting softened. Then, with a trembling hand, she touched the salve to a bruise hidden beneath her shift, and her eyes squeezed shut. Downstairs, a door opened. Heavy boots crossed the floor. Elena's breath stopped. She wiped her fingers on her blanket and sat upright, hands folded in her lap, face empty as stone. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs, as if someone were listening. Then they began to climb. The footsteps climbed like they had all the time in the world. One board creaked under the weight, then another slow and deliberate, as if each sound was a reminder of who owned the house, the stairs, the air in the hallway, and the thin strip of courage Elena kept tucked behind her ribs. She sat on the edge of her cot with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into something blank. The tin of pine salve lay open on the blanket beside her, its sharp scent cutting through the attic's stale wood and dust. The handle turned. The door opened without a knock. Padre Tomas Villarreal filled the frame. Even in lamplight, his cassock looked blacker than the dark, and the silver cross at his throat caught the flame and threw it back in a small, cold wink. He didn't step fully inside at first. He stayed in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the latch, his head tipped as though he were considering a verse. "Elena," he said. "Yes, Father." His gaze moved to the tin. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but Elena felt it the way a rabbit feels a hawk's shadow. "What is that, salve?" she answered, voice steady. She kept her eyes on his collarbone, not his face. Looking into his eyes made her feel like she was standing too close to a cliff. "Where did it come from?" She swallowed. Her throat was dry. "It was left, he repeated, amused. By whom Elena's fingers pressed into one another until the knuckles whitened beneath the wraps. I don't know. A pause stretched between them, tight as wire. Padre Tomas stepped into the room. The floorboard beneath his boot groaned, and Elena's body stiffened instinctively, but she did not flinch. She had trained herself out of flinching the way you train a horse out of bolting hard, painfully over years of quiet punishments. His voice softened. It always softened right before it sharpened. "You know there are people in town who look for any reason to speak ill of this house," he said. "Of the charity we have shown you." "Yes, Father." He took another step close enough now that she could smell tobacco on his breath beneath the incense. His hands were clasped behind his back like a man speaking from a pulpit. "You have been told," he continued, "that you are fortunate." "Yes, Father." "You have been told," he said, "that the Lord sees your obedience and rewards it." "Yes, Father." He stopped in front of her. The lamplight made one side of his face glow warmly, almost kindly. The other side was shadow, and Elena had learned to fear what hid there. "And you have been told," he added, "that gratitude is a form of worship." Elena's mouth was stiff. "Yes, Father." He reached down and picked up the tin. The metal clicked softly against his ring, and Elena's heart jumped. He turned it in his fingers as if he were inspecting something filthy. "Pine," he said, "and something bitter." It helps, Elena heard herself say before she could stop the words. His eyebrows lifted, helps what her tongue felt too big for her mouth. She could not say the right answer. She could not say any answer. She forced her lips into the safest shape. "My hands," she said, "from the lie." He watched her for a long moment. Then he set the tin back down, but not gently. The sound was small, sharp. "Doña Isidora will hear of this," he said. "She will have questions." Elena nodded. "Yes, Father." He leaned slightly forward. His voice dropped into the tone that sounded like care to outsiders and like a lock turning in Elena's mind. "I will not have you drawing attention to yourself," he said. "Not with noises, not with gifts." It wasn't a gift, Elena whispered, because the truth mattered in strange ways even when it didn't matter at all. He just left it. Padre Tomas's eyes narrowed. Who is he? Elena's lungs refused to fill. She forced air in, shallow and quiet. The blacksmith. Something shifted in the room. The lamplight seemed to thin. Padre Tomas's face did not change much, but the warmth left his eyes like a flame snuffed out. "Mateo Cruz," he said, as if tasting the name. Elena did not answer. She didn't trust herself to. "You will not speak to him," Padre Tomas said. "You will not look in his direction. You will not accept what he leaves, no matter how harmless it seems." Elena kept her gaze steady on his throat. "Yes, Father." "You understand why, because you are scared," she thought. "Because your power doesn't work on men like him. Because he's outside the circle of your mercy, and mercy is just another word for control." But she could not say that. So she said the only thing she was allowed. "Yes, Father." Padre Tomas watched her like a man reading a page for hidden ink. Then he straightened, adjusted his collar, and turned away. As he crossed the threshold, he paused. "And Elena," he added, without looking back, his voice suddenly light again. "When you sit in church, you will sit still. Do not make that sound again." "Yes, Father." He closed the door. Elena didn't move until the sound of his boots retreated down the stairs and the study door clicked shut below. Only then did her body begin to tremble, small and silent. She pressed her fists into her thighs until the shaking eased, until she could breathe without the air catching like splinters. She reached under the cot, slid the loose board aside, and pulled out her notebook. The leather was worn smooth from years of fingers. She opened it to a blank page and wrote in tiny, careful letters that felt like stitching her skin back together. June 3rd. He asked about the tin. He knows Mateo's name. He does not like that someone noticed. She underlined the last sentence twice. The pencil scratched softly a secret sound that belonged only to her. Downstairs, the house fell quiet. But Elena stayed awake, listening to the familiar creaks of settling wood, the faint hiss of the lamp through the floor. She held the tin of pine salve under the blanket, like it was contraband, like it was proof that something else existed in the world besides hunger and obedience. Outside, across the plaza, the forge fire in Mateo Cruz's shop burned low and steady, throwing an amber glow into the dark like a held breath. Mateo sat on the edge of his workbench with a half-sharpened blade resting across his knees. The iron was cooling, and he should have been thinking about temper and angle and edge. His hands moved by habit stone, dragging along steel with a slow rasp, but his mind had drifted away from the work. He kept seeing the girl on the church steps, the way she scrubbed without pause, the way her shoulders tightened when the chapel door opened. The way she moved like every joint remembered pain even when her face refused to admit it. He had not meant to leave the tin. He had not meant to step into the orbit of the Villarreal house at all. For 15 years, he had lived on the edge of town on purpose. Close enough for trade, far enough to keep other people's business from sticking to him. The town had learned to leave him alone, and he had returned the favor. He didn't drink in their saloon. He didn't sit in their pews. He didn't take their hands in greeting unless money changed palms. It was easier that way. Safer. He had once been different. Once he had been a man who laughed without thinking, who sang off-key while he worked. Once he had been someone's husband and someone's father. Then the fever came. Clara first, then little Lucia. It took them in the span of a week. The doctor in Taos had shrugged and said it was God's will. Mateo had held Clara's hand as her skin went cold and listened to her make that airless sound at the end. Not a cry, not a scream, just the breath of a body understanding before the mind did. Lucia had made it once too small and broken when she tried not to scare him. Mateo had been too late for both of them. After the burials, he stopped speaking much. Words felt useless in the face of dirt. He folded his voice into the ground beside his family and left it there. Now, in the light of his forge, he found that sound again in a stranger's throat. His jaw tightened. He ran the stone along the blade one more time, slower. The rasping scrape filled the quiet like a confession. Rosa Benali came in through the open doorway without knocking. She always did. She didn't belong to the town, not the way they belonged to themselves, and she didn't ask permission from men who thought they owned land they'd only borrowed from the earth. She carried a small sack of dried chilies and a bundle of tobacco tied with twine. "You're working late," she said. Mateo didn't look up. "Working." Rosa set the sack on the table and watched him for a moment. Her hair was braided and streaked with gray, and her face carried the clean lines of a woman who had learned survival the way others learned prayer. "You're thinking," she corrected. Mateo's hands stilled. He stared at the blade until the metal blurred. Rosa's voice was quiet. "I saw you standing outside the church this morning." Mateo's throat worked once. "Just passing." Rosa made a small sound that might have been laughter if it had warmth. "Passing doesn't look like that." He lifted his eyes finally and met hers. Rosa leaned her hip against the workbench. "In Arroyo Seco, men who look too long lose more than their eyes," she said. "You know that." Mateo's fingers curled around the blade. "I wasn't looking for trouble." "No one is," Rosa replied. "Trouble finds you when you notice what you're not supposed to notice." Mateo's gaze drifted toward the dark plaza beyond the forged doorway, toward the shape of the church against the sky. He didn't say the girl's name. Saying it felt like crossing a line. Rosa followed his look. "The Villarreal house eats people," she said simply, slowly, quietly. "Then they tell the town it was God's plan." Mateo's mouth tightened. "She's hurt." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Hurt is not enough to fight a priest in a land-grant town." Mateo's fingers flexed. The blade in his lap glinted. Rosa stepped closer, and her voice dropped. "If you insist on poking the hornet's nest," she said, "don't use the telegraph in Copper Flats. Too many ears. If you send words, send them from Las Vegas. Or don't send them at all." Mateo stared at her. "Las Vegas is 2 days' ride." Rosa shrugged. "Truth is always farther than lies." He looked back down at the blade. His hands, blackened from iron, trembled almost imperceptibly. It angered him, the tremor, the return of feeling the way his body had started waking up after years of controlled quiet. Rosa watched him in silence for a long moment. Then Mateo spoke the words, coming out rough, like they'd been dragged over stone. "The last time I ignored a sound like that," Mateo said softly to the coals, "someone died." Rosa's face didn't soften, but something in her eyes shifted, understanding settling into place. She nodded once, slow. "Then don't be late." she said. She picked up her sack of chilies and turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. Just remember, she added without looking back, the town will decide what it wants to believe, and it rarely believes a girl over a man in a collar. When she was gone, the forge felt larger, emptier. Mateo sat with the blade across his knees and listened to the fire. It hissed softly, as if it was breathing. He thought about the way Padre Tomas walked through town like he owned the dust, about the way people bowed their heads without realizing they were bowing. He thought about the girl's hands wrapped in linen that couldn't hide red seeping through. He stood, set the blade aside, and walked to the doorway. Across the plaza, the Villarreal house windows were dark. The church bell tower loomed. The whole town slept under the weight of the same story. It told itself every day that the priest was holy, that the charity was mercy, that the girl was lucky. Mateo's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. Not the kind that came with pride, but the kind that came with memory. He turned back into the forge and reached for a piece of paper. His hands hovered over it, uncertain. He hadn't written a letter since Clara's death, not one that mattered. Outside, a dog barked once and went quiet. Mateo stared at the blank page until his eyes burned. On the other side of town, in an attic room that smelled of pine salve and fear, Elena lay awake with her notebook hidden under the cot and the tin tucked beneath her blanket. She listened to the house settle and imagined for a moment the sound of iron ringing on an anvil like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And in the forge, Mateo Cruz finally put pencil to paper. Not because he wanted war, because he had heard that breath in the chapel and understood with sick clarity that if he did nothing, the town would keep sleeping and she would keep breaking in silence. "There are 14 cracks in the ceiling," Elena wrote. "If I count them, I don't have to count what he takes." The pencil tip trembled only once before she steadied it. The attic was thick with heat even though the night air outside had cooled. The adobe walls held the day like a grudge. A single oil lamp flickered on the crate she used as a table, its flame bending whenever wind pressed against the loose shingles above. The ceiling beams were dark with age, and between them ran the thin white fractures she had memorized years ago. 14. She could trace them in the dark if she needed to. She could map them with her eyes closed. Below her, the house had gone quiet. Doña Isidora's cough had subsided. The scrape of Padre Tomas's chair in the study had stopped. The silence after that was never safe, only expectant. Elena pressed the pencil harder. June 4th. He asked about the tin. He knows Mateo's name. She paused, listening. A faint creak sounded from the stairwell. Not footsteps, just wood settling. Still, her body reacted before her mind did. Her shoulders tightened. Her breath shortened. She counted the cracks. 1, 2, 3. The habit had begun when she was 14, the first week after she came to live in the Villarreal house. She had been smaller, then thinner, still believing that obedience could protect her. The attic had seemed temporary, a place to rest until something better came. The first night he climbed the stairs, she had not known what the footsteps meant. The second night she had understood. By the third, she had begun counting. She slid the notebook back beneath the loose board and eased the plank into place. Then she blew out the lamp and lay on her side with her knees drawn up. Her face turned toward the ceiling. 4, 5, 6. If she counted the cracks, she did not have to count the seconds. The handle below turned. Her lungs locked. The stair groaned under weight. She did not move. The footsteps reached the landing and stopped outside her door. For a long moment there was nothing. No breath, no sound. Only the presence of someone standing on the other side of the wood. Elena's hands folded tighter beneath her cheek. Her jaw ached from holding still. The latch rattled once, then silence. The weight shifted. The steps descended again, slow, unhurried. When the study door shut below, Elena released the air she had been holding in pieces. Her body trembled once and then stilled. Not tonight. The knowledge did not bring relief. It only postponed what she had learned, could never be escaped, only delayed. She lay awake long after the house settled completely. The smell of pine from the salve lingered faintly on her hands. She lifted her fingers to her nose and inhaled. Someone had noticed. The thought was dangerous. It burned hotter than fear. In the darkness, she whispered the name she had not allowed herself to speak in years. Soladad. The girl before her. The girl who had lasted 2 years. The girl who had been sent away for what the town called a nervous condition. Elena had been 15 when she found the note. It had been behind the kitchen stove, tucked into the gap where the adobe met the iron. She had been scrubbing ashes when her fingers brushed paper instead of brick. She had almost thrown it away, thinking it trash. But the handwriting was frantic, cramped, pressed so hard into the page it left grooves. He comes when the candles die. She knows. Nobody helps. If you're reading this, run. There had been no signature, but Elena had known. Soladad Vargas. She had remembered Soladad's dark braid, the way she used to hum when she swept the courtyard. The way she stopped humming one winter and never started again. 3 weeks after Soladad disappeared, Padre Tomas had announced from the pulpit that she had been taken to Las Vegas for treatment. A delicate constitution, a mind too tender for hardship. The town had nodded in sympathy. Elena had folded the note and hidden it in her notebook beneath the first page where she began her own record. She had not run. There had been nowhere to go. The next morning, the church bell rang before sunrise. Elena rose stiffly, her joints aching, as if she had been beaten by something invisible in the night. She dressed in silence, pulling her shawl tight even though the air was already warming. In the kitchen, Doña Isidora stood by the stove kneading dough with sharp, efficient movements. "You overslept," she said, without looking up. "I'm sorry," Elena answered. "Sorry does not bake bread." Elena moved to the basin and began washing yesterday's plates again, though they were already clean. Repetition was safer than pause. Isidora's hands worked the dough harder than necessary. "The blacksmith has been asking questions," she said lightly, as if discussing weather. Elena's fingers slipped against the plate. It clinked loudly in the basin. About what, she asked, keeping her voice level. Isidora glanced up. Her eyes were cool and assessing. About Soladad. The name struck like a blow. "He went to the sheriff yesterday afternoon," Isidora continued. "Men like that don't know when to mind their business." Elena's pulse thudded in her ears. "What business?" she asked. Isidora wiped flour from her hands and leaned back against the counter. "The kind that ruins reputations. The kind that poisons a town." She stepped closer. "If anyone asks you about Soledad Vargas, you will say what we told you. She was unstable. She needed care. You were too young to understand." "Yes, ma'am." Isidora studied her face. "You were too young to understand," she repeated. Elena nodded once. The door to the kitchen opened. Padre Tomas entered, already dressed for morning mass. "Jacinta Romero will be delivering eggs," he said. "Make sure she does not linger." "Yes, Father." His gaze rested on Elena for a fraction longer than necessary. "Elena," he said mildly, "gratitude is proven in consistency." "Yes, Father." He left. Elena felt the words settle over her like dust. Outside, sunlight climbed over the ridge and poured into the plaza. The adobe buildings glowed pale gold. The acequia water moved in its narrow channel, steady and indifferent. Across town, Mateo Cruz stood in the sheriff's office, hat in his hands. Sheriff Esteban Salazar leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the corner of his desk. The office smelled of tobacco and old paper. A fly buzzed lazily against the window. "You're telling me," Salazar said slowly, "that Padre Tomas Villarreal, who built half this town with his bare hands, is hurting a girl?" Mateo's jaw was tight. "I'm telling you, she flinches when she sits. Maybe she's got a bad hip. She's 19. Salazar shifted in his chair. "And you know this, how you a doctor?" Now Mateo said nothing. The sheriff removed his boots from the desk and leaned forward. "This town doesn't survive without order. The church keeps that order. You want to tear that down over a feeling. It's not a feeling." "What is it then?" Mateo hesitated. He could not speak about the notebook. He did not have it. He had only the memory of a sound and the image of a girl scrubbing stone with bleeding hands. "She's afraid," he said, finally. "Of what? Of him?" Silence thickened the room. Salazar looked toward the door as if expecting someone to overhear. "You got proof?" Mateo's throat worked. "Bring me proof," the sheriff said. "Not suspicion, not grief. Proof." Mateo nodded once, though the word tasted bitter. When he stepped back into the sunlight, the plaza felt different. People moved in small clusters, speaking in low tones. He caught his name once, then the word Soladad. He stopped near the church steps. Elena was there again, rinsing the basin. She did not look at him. He did not speak. But he saw the way her hands shook slightly when she lifted the bucket. He saw the way Isidora's shadow hovered behind the curtain of the kitchen window, and he understood something that had been forming since the night before. The town would not believe him without proof, but proof did not come from men like him. It came from the people who had been silent the longest. Mateo turned away and walked back toward the forge, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. "Bring me proof." In the attic that evening, Elena pulled the notebook from beneath the board and opened to the page where Soledad's note was tucked. Her fingers traced the indentation of the old pencil marks. "If you're reading this, run." She looked up at the 14 cracks in the ceiling. There was nowhere to run. But there was something else she could do. She turned to a blank page and began writing again, smaller than before, more precise. Not just dates, details, times, what he said, what Isadora did, what the town chose not to see. Each word felt like a nail hammered into something fragile but necessary. If anyone ever asked, if anyone ever demanded proof, if anyone ever stood still long enough to read. Down below, Padre Tomas's voice drifted faintly through the floorboards as he rehearsed Sunday's sermon about humility and the quiet strength of obedient hearts. Elena pressed harder with the pencil until the lead nearly snapped. 14 cracks in the ceiling. She no longer counted to survive. She counted to remember. They said Soledad had a nervous condition, Mateo told Sheriff Esteban Salazar. But nerves don't bruise like that. The words stayed in the air even after Mateo stepped out of the sheriff's office and into the brightness of the plaza. Arroyo Seco Crossing moved as it always did in the morning, slow, deliberate, built around the rhythm of irrigation and prayer. The acequia ran along the main road, its water glinting beneath cottonwood shade. Men were already gathered along its banks, arguing quietly over whose turn it was to divert the flow toward their fields. In this town, water meant corn. Corn meant survival, and survival meant power. Mateo paused near the hitching post outside the general store. He watched Deacon Herrera crouch beside the sluice gate, adjusting the wooden board that controlled the flow. Padre Tomas stood a few paces back, hands clasped, speaking with the rancher Buckley in low tones. No one diverted water without the church's blessing. No one built a fence or extended a field without consulting the man who signed the parish ledger. The land grant had been ratified years ago, but it was the priest who interpreted its boundaries. The priest who mediated disputes. The priest who kept track of who owed tithe and who had fallen short. Mateo felt it then, not just suspicion, not just anger. Structure. The Villarreal house did not only shelter Elena. It sheltered influence. It held the threads that tied water to land, to livelihood, to obedience. If he pulled at one thread, the entire weave would tremble. Sheriff Salazar's words echoed again. Bring me proof. Proof would not stand alone against a man who could close the sluice on a farmer's field. Mateo turned and crossed the plaza toward his forge, but he slowed as he passed the church. The steps were clean, too clean, as if scrubbing had become erasure. Elena stood in the shade near the side entrance, wringing out a rag. Her sleeves were rolled back, the linen wraps on her hands freshly changed. There was a tightness in her posture that had not been there before, a sharpened awareness. She did not look at him, but he saw it, the small bruise near her wrist, half hidden beneath fabric. A boy stepped through the side gate carrying a bundle of split oak on his shoulder. Diego Romero, 14. Freckled, lean, already taller than he had been last winter. He glanced at Elena before setting the wood down. Miss Elena, he said, breathless from the weight. Your firewood. Thank you, Diego, she replied softly. Doña Isidora appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the sound of gratitude. Leave it by the stove, she ordered, and don't dawdle. Diego nodded and moved quickly inside. Mateo watched the exchange from across the road. The way the boy's jaw tightened when Isidora spoke. The way he avoided Padre Tomas's eyes when the priest emerged from the church with Buckley at his side. Children noticed more than adults admitted. Inside the Villarreal kitchen, Diego stacked the wood carefully beside the stove. The air was thick with yeast and lard. Elena kept her back to the doorway while she wiped flour from the counter. Diego, she murmured under her breath, careful not to move her lips too much. Do you remember Soladad? His hands paused. Si, he whispered. She used to hum while she worked. Elena swallowed. What did they tell you when she left? Diego glanced toward the parlor where Isidora's voice drifted faintly. They said she was sick in the head, he replied quietly. My mama said sometimes sickness is just what people call things they don't want to understand. Elena's heart kicked against her ribs. Before she could answer, Isidora's heels struck the floor behind her. That wood will do, Isidora said sharply. Go home. Diego nodded and slipped past her, but as he stepped into the sunlight, his eyes flicked toward Mateo across the plaza. A silent exchange. Not agreement, not conspiracy. Recognition. Mateo turned back toward the forge, the image of Soledad's note replaying in his mind as if he had written it himself. He reached the anvil and lifted the bent horseshoe someone had left the night before. He ran his thumb along the warped iron, a warning or an invitation to retreat. He set it down and reached for a length of chain instead. The steady rhythm of hammer against metal calmed him, but only enough to keep his thoughts from scattering. He had to understand how deep the roots went. Rosa Benali arrived near midday with a sack of dried beans slung over her shoulder. She leaned against the doorway and watched him work. You went to the sheriff, she said. Mateo did not stop hammering. He asked for proof. Rosa nodded once. Proof is heavy. It sinks faster than lies. Mateo struck the iron harder than necessary. Sparks leapt and died. Padre Tomas decides who gets water first, Rosa continued, who is buried in consecrated ground, who receives help when drought comes. I know, Mateo replied. You think men like Buckley will risk their fields for a girl in the attic. The hammer paused mid-air. Mateo exhaled slowly. She's writing it down, he said almost to himself. Rosa's brows lifted. She's writing everything he added. She just doesn't know what to do with it yet. Rosa stepped fully into the forge, her shadow cutting across the dirt floor. Then you'd better make sure she survives long enough to finish, she said. Across town, Sheriff Salazar stood by the acequia watching the water move. He remembered Soledad Vargas, the way she'd stared at her hands while her father signed the transfer paper 3 years ago, the way Padre Tomas had assured him it was necessary, that the girl's mind was fragile, that it was an act of mercy. He remembered the bruise on her collarbone. He had told himself it was none of his concern. Salazar rubbed his jaw and looked toward the church. Mercy. The word had begun to taste wrong. Back in the Villarreal house, Elena waited until the afternoon lull when Isidora retreated to the parlor for embroidery, and Padre Tomas rode out to inspect the irrigation gates. She slipped into the small storage alcove near the kitchen and pulled her notebook from beneath a sack of flour where she had hidden it temporarily. Her hands were steadier now. She turned to a blank page. June 5th. He asked about Soledad. They are afraid of questions. She hesitated. Then she added, Diego remembers her humming. The detail mattered. It meant Soledad had once been whole. Elena pressed the pencil harder. He told the sheriff she was unstable, but unstable girls do not hide notes behind stoves. Her breathing grew shallow as she wrote. If I disappear, it will not be because of nerves. A floorboard creaked. She closed the notebook instantly and slid it back beneath the flour sack just as Isidora's shadow crossed the doorway. Elena Isidora called. Yes, ma'am. Padre Tomas wishes to speak with you when he returns. Elena's pulse spiked. Yes, ma'am. She returned to the basin and began washing the same plate she had washed 3 times already. Outside, Mateo finished shaping the chain and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked toward the church again. The structure of power was clearer now. Padre Tomas did not only control prayer, he controlled water, land, reputation, silence. If Mateo confronted him openly without evidence, he would lose his lease, perhaps his forge, perhaps worse. If Elena continued writing alone, the notebook would be burned before anyone else saw it. He needed time. And he needed someone inside that house who could move without being seen. Diego. The thought unsettled him. The boy was young, but boys grew into men in places like Arroyo Seco, faster than anyone admitted. Across the plaza, Diego sat on the edge of the acequia wall, skipping stones across the narrow channel. He glanced once toward the Villarreal house, then toward the forge. Mateo lifted his chin slightly, a signal so small no one else would notice. Diego's jaw tightened, and he stood. As the sun dipped lower, Padre Tomas rode back into town. Dust rose behind his horse. He dismounted with the ease of a man who believed he was welcomed everywhere. Inside the house, Elena stood in the parlor, hands folded. You spoke to Diego about Soledad, Padre Tomas said without preamble. Elena's stomach dropped. No father. He stepped closer. You forget, he said softly, that walls have ears. Her heart pounded. I only asked if he remembered her, she whispered. And why would you do that? Because she existed. Because I need someone else to say her name. Because if everyone pretends she was sick, then I will be sick too. I was curious, she said instead. Padre Tomas studied her for a long time. Curiosity, he said finally, is a temptation. He reached out and adjusted her shawl as if fixing something modest. You will not speak of Soladad again, he added. Yes, father. He smiled. Good girl. That night, as the attic filled with darkness, Elena counted the cracks again. 14, but this time she did not count to survive. She counted while imagining something else. The sound of iron striking iron, a forge hammer, not far away. And in the forge, Mateo watched Diego approach cautiously through the dusk. The boy stopped just inside the doorway. Mr. Cruz, he said, voice low. If someone had proof, what would you do with it? Mateo looked at him carefully. Protect it, he answered. Diego nodded once hard. The town bell rang for evening prayer, and the sound carried across Arroyo Seco like a warning. The structure was clear now, and structures Mateo knew could crack, but only if you struck in the right place. A man who lives alone too long starts looking for something to ruin, Doña Isidora said, and the town nodded like it was scripture. She said it in the plaza just after morning mass, loud enough for the women gathered near the well, and soft enough to sound reluctant. The trick Elena had learned was never to accuse directly. You only had to suggest. The rest of the town would do the work for you. Elena stood behind the church wall with a basket of folded linens in her arms, listening to the words drift like ash. Isidora adjusted her shawl and sighed as if burdened by charity. Padre Tomas has shown nothing but kindness to that girl, she continued. Food, shelter, protection. And now this blacksmith, this solitary man, starts circling. It's not natural. Sister Luz clucked her tongue. He's never been right since his wife passed. Grief makes a man strange, another woman added. And strange men look for someone to blame, Isidora finished. The circle hummed with agreement. Heads nodded, eyes narrowed. The story began forming its own spine. Elena lowered her gaze to the linens. Her hands did not shake. She had learned to keep her body still when the world moved against her. Across the plaza, Mateo Cruz stood near his forge, listening without appearing to. He held a length of chain in his hands and let the iron rest against the anvil without striking it. He did not need to hear every word. He understood the pattern. Reputation first. Doubt second, isolation third. He had seen it before in other towns, other territories. When someone threatened a system, the system defended itself by shifting the danger outward. A man who lives alone too long. Mateo felt the weight of the phrase settle over him like dust. He had lived alone for 15 years. He had done so deliberately to keep grief contained, to avoid attachment that might be taken from him again. Now that solitude was being recast as menace. Diego appeared at the edge of the forge doorway, hesitant. They're talking about you, the boy said quietly. I know. They say you've been asking questions about Soladad. Mateo's jaw tightened, and he prompted. Diego shifted his weight. My mama says when powerful people feel watched, they make sure someone else looks guilty. Mateo let out a breath through his nose. Your mama is right. Diego glanced toward the church steps where Isidora now stood with Buckley and Deacon Herrera. Padre Tomas joined them moments later, his expression calm, almost amused. Mateo watched the priest's hand rest briefly on Buckley's shoulder, a gesture that could be blessing or warning, depending on how you rate it. He understood something with sharp clarity. This was not only about Elena. It was about maintaining order. And order in Arroyo Seco ran through the church, through the acequia, through the men who owed their fields to a signature. Mateo lifted the bent horseshoe from the shelf and turned it in his palm. It had been left on his anvil the night before, a symbol among ranchers. "You're out of line." "Did you see who left this?" he asked Diego. The boy shook his head. "Everyone's saying you're meddling." Mateo studied the warped iron. "Meddling," he repeated. A horse clopped across the plaza. Sheriff Salazar dismounted in front of the general store. He glanced toward the forge but did not approach. The sheriff's silence was telling. Diego leaned closer. "What if they take your lease?" Mateo's mouth flattened. The forge stood on land leased from the parish trust. If Padre Tomas called for review, the council would comply. Without the forge, Mateo was only a widower with calloused hands and no place to stand. "Then I'll find somewhere else to work," Mateo said. Diego frowned. "There isn't anywhere else." Mateo didn't answer. Inside the Villarreal house, Elena scrubbed the kitchen table for the third time that morning. The wood had long since lost any stain that might have justified the effort, but repetition kept her from listening too closely to the voices drifting through the open window. "Strange men," Isidora's voice floated in again, this time closer. "They create stories to give their grief purpose." Elena pressed harder with the rag. Padre Tomas entered the kitchen without announcing himself. She felt his presence before she saw him. "Elena," he said mildly. "Yes, Father." "You will keep your distance from Mateo Cruz." "Yes, Father." "You will not speak to him." "Yes, Father." He stepped closer. "You will not accept what he offers." Her pulse jumped. "Yes, Father." He studied her face carefully. She kept her expression smooth. "He is unstable," Padre Tomas said. "Lonely men imagine things. They project their own brokenness onto others." Elena swallowed. "Yes, Father." He reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers. Not forcefully, just enough to remind her of his authority. "You are safe here," he said. "Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." The lie landed softly. Elena nodded. He released her and left the room. She stood alone for several seconds before realizing she had been holding her breath. Safe. The word echoed in her skull with bitter clarity. That afternoon, the council gathered informally near the acequia. Buckley argued about water diversion. Deacon Herrera nodded along. Padre Tomas listened and offered measured solutions, his voice weaving through the conversation like thread binding fabric. Mateo watched from across the road. Control the water. Control the land. Control the narrative. The forge felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted inward. Rosa Benali appeared at the doorway again this time, carrying a bundle of dried herbs. "You look like a man calculating distance," she observed. "I am." Rosa leaned against the frame. "Distance from what? From losing everything." She nodded slowly. "They've started." "Yes." She followed his gaze to the council. "You're not fighting a man," she said quietly. "You're fighting a structure." Mateo's jaw flexed. "They'll try to make you leave before you can make them answer," she continued. "I know." Rosa studied him carefully. "You still intend to send word to Las Vegas?" Mateo hesitated. "If Soledad Vargas is alive," Rosa said, "she may speak. And if she doesn't, then the silence wins." Mateo turned the bent horseshoe over once more. "I won't let that happen," he said. Rosa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then don't use Copper Flats. Too many ears there. Las Vegas Telegraph is farther but safer. I'll go tomorrow," Mateo said. "Tomorrow might be too late," Rosa replied. He met her gaze. She didn't elaborate. Evening fell slowly over Arroyo Seco. The sky turned amber, then bruised purple. The bell rang for prayer and families moved toward the church in subdued lines. Elena remained behind to tidy the kitchen. The house felt heavier tonight, as if the walls were listening more closely than usual. She finished washing the last plate and slipped into the storage alcove. Her hands found the notebook beneath the flour sack. She opened it carefully. June 6th. They are turning him into the threat. Her pencil pressed deeper than usual. They say lonely men invent danger. She paused, listening for footsteps. Nothing yet. She continued. If they make him leave, there will be no one left who noticed. Her hand trembled. She closed the notebook and slid it back into hiding just as Isidora's shadow crossed the doorway. Elena, she called. Bring the lamp upstairs. Yes, ma'am. Elena lifted the oil lamp and followed the narrow stair to the attic. Each step felt steeper tonight. She set the lamp on the crate and waited. The house quieted below. A door shut. A chair scraped. Then the footsteps began. Not hesitant, certain. Elena's throat tightened. The latch turned. Padre Tomas stepped inside. His eyes swept the room, slowly lingering on her face. I heard you ask Diego about Soladad again, he said. He raised a hand. Curiosity leads to trouble, he said softly, and trouble leads to consequences. She lowered her eyes. Yes, Father. He stepped closer. You are fortunate, he continued. Remember that. She nodded. When he finally left, the air felt thinner than before. Elena waited until the footsteps retreated fully before moving. She knelt and slid the loose board aside, retrieving the notebook once more. She wrote by lamplight, smaller than ever. June 6th. They are afraid of questions. They are afraid of names. She hesitated. Then she added, if he leaves town, I will have no witness. The pencil hovered above the page. A thought formed that frightened her more than anything Padre Tomas had said. Maybe I must become the proof. She closed the notebook and hid it again. Across town, Mateo saddled his horse under cover of darkness. Diego stood nearby, watching. You're leaving, the boy asked. For a day, Mateo replied. To Las Vegas, Mateo paused. Diego nodded once. I won't say anything, he promised. Mateo mounted the horse. The church bell tolled once, echoing across the plaza. A warning, or a summons. Mateo turned his horse toward the eastern road, the bent horseshoe tucked into his saddlebag like a reminder. Behind him, the forge fire dimmed. Ahead of him, the desert stretched dark and uncertain. And in the attic, Elena lay awake, counting cracks in the ceiling, not to survive, but to measure how long she had, before someone decided silence was safer than truth. If that letter reaches Las Vegas, Padre Tomas said in the dark below the attic floor, we will have a problem. Elena lay flat against the rough boards, her ear pressed to the seam where two planks met. The wood smelled of dust and old oil, and a splinter bit into her cheek, but she did not move. Below her, the murmur of voices drifted up through the ceiling like smoke through cracks in adobe. What letter? Doña Isidora asked sharply. The blacksmith rode east before dawn, Padre Tomas replied. His tone was measured, controlled, but there was something tight beneath it, like a string pulled too hard. Rosa Benali saw him take the Las Vegas road. Las Vegas? The word thudded against Elena's ribs. He wouldn't dare, Isidora said. He has nothing. He has curiosity, Padre Tomas answered. And curiosity is more dangerous than possession. Elena's breath went shallow. You told me you handled Soladad properly, Isidora pressed. I did, Padre Tomas snapped, and the sudden edge in his voice made Elena flinch against the floorboards. But if the sanatorium responds, if anyone writes back, it invites inquiry. From whom? Isidora demanded. From anyone who thinks themselves righteous. Silence followed. Then the scrape of a chair. You must stop him, Isidora said. Before he drags this town into scandal, I intend to, Padre Tomas replied. Elena pulled back from the floor slowly, careful not to let the boards creak. Her heart pounded so loudly, she feared they would hear it below. Las Vegas. She had not known he would go that far. She crawled back toward her cot and sat on the edge, staring at the 14 cracks in the ceiling. If that letter reaches Las Vegas. She swung her legs off the cot and slid the loose board aside, retrieving her notebook. Her hands trembled as she opened it. June 7th. He rode east. They are afraid. The pencil left faint grooves in the paper where her grip tightened. They are not afraid of lies. They are afraid of records. She paused, listening. The house was quiet now. The conversation below had ended, but the silence felt different, charged. She pressed her lips together and added another line. If they stop him, I must warn him. The thought settled in her stomach like a stone. Warn him how she had no freedom of movement. Every step she took was accounted for. Every glance was measured. But she had one small advantage. Routine. At dawn, she fetched water from the pump near the plaza. It was the only time she crossed the open space without Isidora's shadow at her back. She closed the notebook and replaced it beneath the board. Across the desert road, Mateo Cruz rode hard under the pale wash of early sun. The land between Arroyo Seco and Las Vegas was dry and unforgiving, scattered with sage and rock. Dust rose in small spirals behind his horse's hooves. He had not told anyone he was leaving. He had not told Diego, but he suspected the boy had guessed. Mateo's jaw tightened. He had written the letter in careful strokes the night before. To Dr. Elias Whitlock, Las Vegas Sanatorium. He had kept it brief. Inquire regarding patient Soladad Vargas admitted from Arroyo Seco Crossing approximately 3 years prior. Condition current status is correspondence permitted. He had not mentioned Padre Tomas by name. He had not needed to. The weight of the question carried its own accusation. The wind tugged at his coat as he rode. He thought of Elena's hands wrapped in linen that did not hide the red beneath. He thought of the way the town nodded when Isidora spoke. He thought of Sheriff Salazar's words. Bring me proof. Proof did not fall from the sky. It had to be sought. Back in Arroyo Seco, the morning bell rang. Elena moved through the kitchen quietly, lifting the empty bucket from its hook. Make it quick, Isidora said without looking up from her embroidery. The dough needs tending. Yes, ma'am. Elena stepped into the plaza with the bucket swinging lightly at her side. The air was cool, the sky just beginning to brighten. A few men were already at the acequia adjusting the wooden gates. She walked slowly toward the pump. The forge stood dark, empty. Her stomach tightened. He had gone. She set the bucket beneath the spout and began to work the handle. Water splashed into the basin with a hollow echo. Her mind moved quickly. If they are afraid of the letter reaching Las Vegas, they may try to intercept it. She glanced toward the trading post. Rosa Benali stood in the doorway watching the plaza with unreadable eyes. Elena's heart beat faster. Rosa knew. She lifted the bucket and carried it toward the trough beside the forge. The wooden basin still held rainwater from the previous night. She set her bucket down as if resting. Then she slipped her hand into her apron pocket. A scrap of paper. She had written it before leaving the house in the dim light before dawn. They know. Be careful. 4 words. She folded it small enough to fit beneath her thumb. She leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust the trough lid and let the note drop into the water. It floated for a moment, then sank beneath the surface. Elena picked up her bucket and walked back toward the Villarreal house without looking back. Rosa watched from the doorway. She waited until Elena disappeared inside before crossing the plaza. She moved without hurry as if she had nothing better to do. When she reached the trough, she knelt to rinse her hands. Her fingers slipped beneath the water. She retrieved the folded scrap, dripping and smudged. They know. Be careful. Rosa did not smile. She tucked the paper into her sleeve. Mateo reached Las Vegas by late afternoon. The telegraph office stood near the edge of town, a low building with a single wire stretching eastward like a promise. Dr. Elias Whitlock sat behind the counter, spectacles perched low on his nose. "Cruz," he said, looking up with faint surprise. "Haven't seen you since Clara." Mateo nodded once. "I need to send an inquiry," he said. Whitlock gestured toward the desk. Mateo handed over the folded letter. Whitlock read it slowly, his brows drawing together. "Vargas," he murmured. "I remember that name." Mateo's pulse quickened. "She was admitted 3 years ago." Whitlock continued. "Under clerical recommendation, is she still here?" Mateo asked. Whitlock hesitated. "I'll send word," he said finally. "But you should know facilities like ours do not answer lightly." "I'll wait," Mateo replied. Whitlock tapped out the message in steady rhythm. Each click felt like a hammer strike. Back in Arroyo Seco, Rosa stepped into the forge just as dusk fell. She placed the damp scrap of paper on Mateo's workbench. He returned near nightfall, exhausted and dust-coated. He dismounted stiffly and led his horse toward the stable. The forge door stood open. He saw Rosa waiting inside. Without speaking, she held out the paper. Mateo unfolded it. "They know. Be careful." His jaw tightened. "How long ago?" he asked. "This morning," Rosa said. Mateo looked toward the church. "They're afraid," Rosa continued. "That means you're close, or that I'm about to lose everything," he replied. Rosa tilted her head. "You already decided to risk that." He exhaled slowly. "The sheriff won't move without proof," he said. "If Las Vegas responds, and if they don't," Mateo folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Then I find another way," he said. Across the plaza, the Villarreal house windows glowed softly. In the attic, Elena lay awake again, counting the cracks. 14. The footsteps had not come tonight. But the silence felt heavier. She stared at the ceiling and wondered whether the letter had already reached Las Vegas, or whether someone had ridden faster than Mateo. Downstairs, Padre Tomas sat at his desk with pen poised above fresh paper. He began writing to Dr. Whitlock as well. His words were smooth and deliberate. Concern regarding former ward Soladad Vargas. Her condition unstable. Release would cause distress. He sanded the ink and sealed the envelope. If one letter had been sent, another could counter it. Control the narrative. Control the outcome. He leaned back in his chair, confident in the machinery of influence he had built. Above him, Elena's eyes remained open in the dark. She no longer counted the cracks to survive. She counted them to measure the distance between truth and discovery. And across town, Mateo sat in the dim forge light, the damp warning resting in his pocket like a pulse. He understood now. They were watching him, and that meant they were afraid of what might come back through that wire. "If I disappear," Elena wrote, "these pages are the only voice I have." The words looked smaller than the fear behind them. She stared at the sentence for a long time, the pencil resting between her fingers. The attic was thick with heat, and the lamp flame trembled in the still air. Beneath her, the house creaked softly, as if it were breathing in its sleep. Disappear. The word did not feel dramatic. It felt practical. Soladad had disappeared. One Sunday, she had been kneeling beside the pews, her braid falling forward over her shoulder. By the next, she had been a prayer request. Elena pressed her palm flat against the page as if she could steady it into permanence. If I disappear. The thought had taken root the moment she heard Padre Tomas speak of Las Vegas in the dark below her floor. If they were afraid enough to send letters, they were afraid enough to remove what threatened them. She closed the notebook and slid it beneath the loose board under her cot. For years it had lived there safe only because no one had thought to look. Now she no longer trusted that safety. Morning came dry and windless. Elena rose before Isadora called her and moved through her chores without speaking. Every action felt sharpened, deliberate. She carried the bucket to the pump-kneaded dough, swept ash from the hearth. Diego arrived mid-morning with another bundle of firewood. He stepped into the kitchen quietly, eyes lowered. "Stack it by the stove," Isadora ordered. "Yes, ma'am." Elena kept her back turned while he worked. When Isadora stepped into the parlor to greet a visiting woman, Elena moved quickly. "Diego," she whispered. He glanced up. "If someone asked you to carry something," she said carefully, "would you do it?" His freckles stood out against the sudden pallor of his face. "For you," he asked. She nodded once. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Her throat tightened. "Not now," she murmured. "But soon." He nodded again, solemn, and turned back to the wood as Isadora's footsteps returned. Across town, Mateo stood inside the forge reading the reply from Las Vegas. Whitlock's handwriting was cramped and cautious. Patient Soladad Vargas remains under care. Condition recorded as acute hysteria upon admission. No immediate release planned. Further correspondence discouraged. Mateo read the lines twice. Acute hysteria. He crushed the paper slightly in his fist. The words felt rehearsed, protective, not medical defensive. Rosa stood in the doorway watching him. "They answered," she said. "Yes, and they're keeping her." Rosa's gaze sharpened. "Or someone is keeping her," she replied. Mateo nodded. He knew enough about institutions to understand how easily one signature could trap a person inside walls. He thought of Elena's note. "They know. Be careful." If Padre Tomas had written as well, he would not write with accusation. He would write with concern, with pastoral language, with words like protection. Mateo folded Whitlock's letter and slipped it into his pocket beside Elena's warning. "She needs to know," he said quietly. Rosa studied him. "And what will she do with that knowledge?" Mateo hesitated. "She's writing," he said. "Everything." Rosa's eyes darkened slightly. "Then those pages are more dangerous than any telegraph." Inside the Villarreal house, Elena felt the shift before she understood it. Padre Tomas watched her more closely now. His questions were softer but more frequent. Isadora lingered in doorways longer than usual, that evening when the bell rang for prayer. Padre Tomas paused at the threshold and looked back at Elena. "You have been very quiet," he observed. "Yes, Father." "Silence can be virtuous," he said, "but it can also hide rebellion." Her pulse stuttered. "I have nothing to hide," she answered carefully. He held her gaze for a moment too long. "See that you don't." When the house finally settled for the night, Elena waited. She counted to 200. Then she slid from her cot and retrieved the notebook. The pages felt heavier than they had ever felt before. "If I disappear, these pages are the only voice I have." She traced the sentence again. The thought formed fully now. The notebook could not remain here. She wrapped it in a scrap of cloth torn from an old apron. She tied the bundle tightly and tucked it beneath her shawl. Her hands trembled not from fear of being caught, but from the weight of entrusting it to someone else. Morning brought opportunity. Diego returned just after sunrise, carrying kindling. Elena met him at the back gate before Isadora could see. I need you to take something, she whispered, pressing the wrapped bundle into his hands. His eyes widened. To the forge, he asked. Yes. Where? In the coal bin, she replied. Under the charcoal. He swallowed hard. What is it? My proof. The word startled both of them. Will I be in trouble? He asked quietly. She looked at him. You already are, she said gently. He nodded once, fierce and frightened at the same time. I'll do it, he said. He tucked the bundle beneath his shirt and slipped through the alley behind the feed store, taking the long way toward the forge. Elena stood at the gate watching until he disappeared. Her chest felt hollow. Inside the forge, Mateo was shaping a hinge when Diego burst through the doorway, breathless. Mr. Cruz, he said, glancing over his shoulder. Mateo set down the hammer. What is it? Diego pulled the bundle from beneath his shirt and held it out. She said to put it in the coal bin, he whispered. But I thought you should see. Mateo took the cloth carefully. He felt the weight immediately. He knew what it was before he unwrapped it. The notebook lay in his hands, worn leather edges, soft from years of hiding. His throat tightened. Did anyone see you? He asked. Diego shook his head. I cut behind the feed store. Mateo nodded. Go home, he said, and don't come back today. Diego hesitated. You're going to help her? He asked. Mateo met the boy's eyes. Yes. Diego nodded and ran. Mateo sat down slowly on the stool beside the anvil. He opened the notebook. The first entry was dated 5 years ago, October 12th. He came after midnight. The handwriting was small but steady. November 3rd. Isadora held my arms. December 19th. I could not walk today. January 8th. He said if I told anyone I would end up where Soladad did. Page after page. Dates, details, times. He read everything. The forge fire hissed softly behind him, but he did not hear it. His jaw locked tighter with each entry. She had written not like a girl imagining stories. She had written like a witness building a case. When he reached the most recent page, if I disappear, these pages are the only voice I have. His hands shook. Not from doubt. From clarity. This was the proof Sheriff Salazar demanded. Not bruises that faded. Not whispers that could be dismissed. A record. 5 years of ink refusing to forget. Mateo closed the notebook and pressed it briefly against his chest. He rose and crossed the forge to the iron lockbox beneath his workbench. The box had once held Clara's letters and Lucia's carved wooden horse. He opened it. He placed Elena's notebook inside. He locked the box and slipped the key onto a leather cord around his neck. The weight settled against his skin. Across town, Elena felt the absence immediately. The space beneath the loose board felt wrong when she touched it. Hollow. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. The fear that had followed her for years loosened slightly, not because she was safe, but because the truth was no longer trapped alone with her. That afternoon, Padre Tomas stood in the plaza speaking with Deacon Herrera and Buckley. The blacksmith's lease, he said casually, is up for review this week. Buckley frowned. He's paid through the year. Leases can be reconsidered, Padre Tomas replied smoothly. Deacon Herrera shifted uneasily. We must protect this community from instability, Padre Tomas continued. The word hung between them. Instability. That evening, Diego ran to the forge again, breathless. They're talking about Friday, he said. Talking about what? Reviewing your land. Mateo nodded once. He had expected as much. The structure was tightening. He glanced toward the iron lockbox beneath the bench. Proof now rested within his reach, but proof was only useful if it was heard. Diego, he said quietly, does your mother trust Sheriff Salazar? The boy hesitated. She says he sees more than he says. Mateo exhaled slowly. That might be enough, he murmured. As dusk fell over Arroyo Seco, Elena stood by the attic window and watched the faint glow of the forge across the plaza. For the first time in 5 years, she was not alone with her record. The fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. Below her, Padre Tomas paced his study floor. He sensed something slipping. Control was not lost in one moment. It eroded. And somewhere beyond his reach, the erosion had already begun. In the forge, Mateo stood alone with the locked box at his feet, and the council's coming decision looming over him. He understood now. They would try to remove him before he could speak, and if he waited, the notebook might never be read. He lifted his eyes toward the church steeple cutting into the darkening sky. Friday was approaching, and this time he would not come empty-handed. "You accuse a priest with charcoal-stained hands," Padre Tomas said. "Be careful who you try to bury." The council room smelled of dust tobacco and old wood that had absorbed years of quiet agreements. It was the back chamber of the general store, a place meant for counting grain shipments and settling disputes over fence lines, not for unraveling the spine of a town. 5 men sat at the long table: Buckley Deacon Herrera, old Martin Velasco Sheriff Esteban Salazar, and Padre Tomas Villarreal himself. A lantern hung from a hook overhead, casting light unevenly across their faces. The flame flickered every time the door shifted in its frame. Mateo Cruz stood at the far end of the table, hat in his hand, iron dust still clinging to the cuffs of his shirt. He had not changed before coming. He had not tried to soften the evidence of who he was. Charcoal-stained hands. The iron lockbox rested on the table before him. Buckley cleared his throat. "We're here to review the lease of the forge property." He began glancing at Padre Tomas as though awaiting approval. Padre Tomas folded his hands calmly. "There have been disturbances," he said. "Rumors, questions that unsettle this community." Mateo did not move. "Your lease," Buckley continued, "is under parish trust. The trust answers to the church, and the church answers to God," Padre Tomas added softly. A faint murmur of agreement passed through the room. Sheriff Salazar remained silent, his gaze fixed on the iron lockbox. Mateo's pulse beat steadily against the leather cord beneath his shirt, where the key hung warm against his skin. "Disturbances," Mateo repeated evenly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Buckley frowned. "You've been asking about Soladad Vargas." "Yes. Her family signed her admission," Deacon Herrera said quickly. "It was a mercy." Mateo's jaw tightened. "Mercy doesn't bruise a collarbone," he said. The room went still. Padre Tomas leaned back slightly, his expression almost amused. "You accuse a priest with charcoal-stained hands?" he asked. "Be careful who you try to bury." Mateo felt the weight of every eye in the room. "I'm not accusing," he replied. "I'm presenting." He placed his hand on the lockbox. Buckley stiffened. "What is that proof?" Mateo said. The word landed heavier than he intended. Padre Tomas's gaze sharpened. "Proof of what Deacon Herrera asked." Mateo did not answer immediately. He pulled the key from around his neck and unlocked the box. The metallic click echoed in the small room. He lifted the leather-bound notebook carefully and set it on the table. Sheriff Salazar leaned forward instinctively. "What is this?" Buckley demanded. 5 years, Mateo said quietly, written in ink. Padre Tomas did not reach for the book. He did not need to. "Whose?" he asked. "Elena Marisol Alvarez's." The air shifted. Buckley blinked. The girl, yes. Martin Velasco swallowed audibly. Padre Tomas's face did not change. Curious, he said, that a girl under my care would hide a diary. Not hide, Mateo replied. Record. He pushed the notebook toward Sheriff Salazar. The sheriff hesitated only a moment before opening it. The pages rustled in the lantern light. October 12th. He came after midnight. Salazar's brow furrowed. He turned the page. November 3rd. Isadora held my arms. A breath caught somewhere at the table. Padre Tomas's hands remained folded. She is a fragile child, he said evenly. Imaginative, prone to hysteria. Sheriff Salazar did not look up. December 19th. I could not walk today. The room felt smaller. Buckley shifted in his chair. Anyone can write anything, he muttered. Mateo met his gaze. For 5 years, silence. Salazar turned more pages, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing. January 8th. He said if I told anyone I would end up where Soladad did. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Padre Tomas leaned forward at last, resting his elbows lightly on the table. This is slander, he said calmly, the product of a troubled mind influenced by grief and gossip. Mateo's fists clenched at his sides. She wrote about Soladad before I ever asked, he said. Salazar looked up sharply. What do you mean? Mateo stepped closer to the table. She found a note, he said. Left by Soladad. Hidden behind a stove. Buckley's face paled slightly. Padre Tomas's voice remained steady. Soladad was ill. Was she? Mateo asked. Salazar's eyes flicked between them. The tension in the room thickened until it felt almost visible. Deacon Herrera wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. This is dangerous, he murmured. If word spreads, word is already spreading, Mateo replied. Padre Tomas stood slowly. The lantern light caught his silver cross. You think you are righteous, he said softly to Mateo. But righteousness without authority is chaos. And authority without righteousness, Mateo asked. The priest's eyes hardened. Buckley slammed his palm lightly on the table. Enough. The words snapped through the room. Salazar closed the notebook carefully. He did not return it immediately. Is this your handwriting? He asked Mateo. No. You saw her write yes. Why bring it now? Mateo's throat tightened. Because you asked for proof. Salazar's gaze shifted to Padre Tomas. Did you know she was writing? He asked. Padre Tomas did not hesitate. No. And you deny these accusations? I deny any wrongdoing, he said firmly. I have devoted my life to this town. Devotion doesn't erase ink, Mateo replied. Buckley stood abruptly. This is madness, he said. We cannot condemn a priest based on scribbles. Then read them, Mateo shot back. Salazar's fingers tapped lightly on the notebook's cover. He looked older than he had that morning. We will need time, he said finally. Padre Tomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Time for what he asked. For truth, Salazar replied. The words settled like dust after a storm. Buckley frowned. In the meantime, what of the lease? Salazar looked at Mateo, then at Padre Tomas. No action will be taken until this is resolved, he said. Buckley opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The balance had shifted, if only slightly. Padre Tomas picked up his hat from the table. You are inviting scandal, he said quietly to Salazar. I'm inviting clarity, the sheriff answered. The priest's eyes flicked toward Mateo. This will not end well for you, he said softly. Mateo held his gaze. It hasn't ended well for her, he replied. Padre Tomas turned and walked out of the room without another word. The door closed behind him with a hollow thud. The remaining men sat in uneasy silence. Salazar slid the notebook back toward Mateo, but kept his hand resting on it. If this is true, he said carefully, it changes everything. It is true, Mateo answered. Salazar studied him for a long moment. And if it isn't, he added, you've declared war on the church. Mateo did not flinch. I didn't start it, Buckley exhaled sharply. We will reconvene tomorrow, he said. No word of this leaves this room. But they all knew that rooms in Arroyo Seco were never fully sealed. Outside the plaza was dim under the lowering sun. Elena stood at the pump pretending to scrub the bucket rim. She had seen the men enter the general store. She had seen the tension in their shoulders. Her chest felt tight with something she could not name. Across the square, Padre Tomas emerged first. His stride was controlled. His face was composed, but his eyes were colder than she had ever seen them. He paused briefly in the center of the plaza and looked directly at her. Not long, just long enough. A warning. Elena lowered her gaze and kept scrubbing. Moments later, Mateo stepped out of the store. He did not look at her. He walked straight to the forge, but she saw the way his shoulders were set. She saw the way his jaw was clenched. Something had shifted. The town felt different now, as if a crack had appeared beneath its surface and no one knew how deep it ran. Inside the general store, Sheriff Salazar remained seated, staring at the empty chair where Padre Tomas had been. He reached for the notebook again and opened it to the first page. October 12th, he came after midnight. The ink did not waver. 5 years. He closed the book slowly. Truth had entered the room, and once truth was read aloud, it did not return quietly to hiding. Outside, the church bell rang for evening prayer. The sound rolled across Arroyo Seco crossing, steady and certain. But beneath it, something else now moved, quiet, deliberate, impossible to unhear. And somewhere beyond the town limits, a telegraph wire hummed faintly in the fading light, carrying words that had not yet arrived. The sanatorium is closing, the rider said, patients returning home. The words reached Arroyo Seco crossing before the dust of the horse had fully settled. It was late afternoon when the rider came in from the eastern road, his hat pulled low against the sun, his coat streaked with the pale powder of miles. He did not slow until he reached the general store where Sheriff Salazar stood in the shade speaking quietly with Buckley. I'm looking for Esteban Salazar, the rider called. That would be me, the sheriff replied. The man dismounted stiffly and reached into his saddlebag. Telegram from Las Vegas, he said. Dr. Whitlock asked it be delivered direct. Mateo Cruz, who had been leaning against the hitching post across the plaza, felt his pulse sharpen. He straightened without realizing it. Sheriff Salazar broke the seal. The plaza seemed to quiet as he read. Buckley shifted his weight impatiently. Well, Salazar's eyes flicked up, then back down to the paper. The sanatorium is closing, he said slowly. Patients returning home. The rider added almost as an afterthought, list of names included. Vargas is among them. The name fell like a stone into water. Vargas, Soladad Vargas. Mateo's chest tightened. Buckley's mouth opened slightly. Returning, here discharged to family or parish of record. Salazar read. Across the plaza, the church door creaked open. Padre Tomas stepped into the sunlight, his cassock catching the late glow. He moved toward the general store with measured calm, as though summoned by instinct. What news? He asked lightly. Salazar looked at him. The sanatorium in Las Vegas is closing, he said. They're releasing patients. Padre Tomas's expression did not change. That is unfortunate, he replied. Some souls are better protected from the world. Vargas is returning, Salazar said. For the first time, a flicker, small but unmistakable, passed through the priest's eyes. Is she? He murmured. The rider cleared his throat. Doctor, Whitlock said arrangements are being made. within the week. Buckley ran a hand over his face. This is complicated. Mateo stepped forward. Complicated how he asked evenly. Padre Tomas turned to him. You have involved yourself deeply in matters you do not understand, he said softly. I understand enough, Mateo replied. The plaza had begun to fill. Women carrying baskets slowed their steps. Children paused mid-game. News moved faster than wind in a town like Arroyo Seco. Jacinta Romero emerged from the feed store, wiping her hands on her apron. Returning, she echoed quietly. Salazar folded the telegram. She'll be brought under escort, he said. That's what it says, under escort, to whom Buckley demanded. Her parish of records, Salazar answered. All eyes shifted to Padre Tomas. The priest inclined his head slightly. As her spiritual guardian, he said, it falls to me. The words were smooth, almost generous. Mateo felt heat rise behind his ribs. She should not return to your house, he said. Buckley shot him a warning glance. You're in no position to dictate parish matters. I'm in position to recognize a pattern, Mateo replied. Padre Tomas's gaze hardened. You mistake your personal grief for authority, he said. Again. Grief doesn't write 5 years of dates, Mateo answered. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Salazar raised a hand. Enough, he said. The rider, sensing tension he wanted no part of, mounted quickly. I've delivered what I was told, he said, and rode off before anyone could stop him. The plaza remained suspended in uneasy silence. Padre Tomas turned slowly to the gathering townspeople. We will welcome Soladad back with compassion, he said, his voice carrying easily. She has suffered much. Let us not add shame to her burden. The words were perfect, merciful, measured. Elena stood near the pump, clutching the handle so tightly her knuckles whitened beneath the linen. Returning. The word felt unreal. For years, Soladad had existed only in whispers and ink. Now she was flesh again. Returning, Elena's breath quickened. If Soladad came back and spoke, her heart leapt, then stilled, or she might not speak at all. Inside the Villarreal house that evening, Padre Tomas wrote another letter. The desk lamp cast a steady circle of light across the paper. To Dr. Whitlock, he began. He wrote of Soledad's delicate condition, of the stress that travel might cause, of the stability Arroyo Seco could not guarantee. He suggested alternate placement. He emphasized pastoral concern. He sanded the ink carefully. Isadora stood behind him, her hands clasped. You must delay her, she said. I intend to, he replied. And if she speaks, she will not, he said calmly. She remembers where she belongs. Isadora's jaw tightened. And the girl upstairs, upon a stump, she is being managed. Above them, Elena lay flat against the attic floor again, her ear pressed to the boards. Returning. Her heart beat so loudly she feared it would betray her. If Soledad returned and told the truth, Elena would not stand alone. If Soledad returned and remained silent. The thought hollowed her out. She pulled the notebook from beneath the loose board, forgetting for a moment that it was no longer there. Her fingers met emptiness. A strange relief washed through her. It was safe. In the forge. With Mateo. She lit the lamp and stared at the ceiling. 14 cracks. For the first time, she imagined a different number. 2 voices. Across town, Mateo sat at his workbench with the telegram open beside Elena's notebook. Returning. He read the line again. Vargas among those discharged. Rosa Benali stood near the doorway, arms folded. They didn't expect that she said. No, Mateo agreed. And now Mateo looked toward the church steeple rising above the adobe roofs. Now they'll try to stop her. Rosa nodded. You think the sheriff will let them? Mateo hesitated. Salazar sees the ink, he said. But seeing and acting aren't the same. Rosa stepped closer to the bench. If she arrives, she said she will need protection. Mateo's jaw tightened. I won't let her walk back into that house, he said. You can't fight them alone. Rosa replied quietly. I'm not alone. He tapped the notebook. The pages seemed heavier now, as if they carried not just Elena's voice, but Soladad's as well. In the plaza, Sheriff Salazar stood alone long after the others had dispersed. He unfolded the telegram again. Returning home. He thought of the first day Soladad had been taken away, the way she had not cried, the way she had not resisted, the way her father had avoided looking at her. He had told himself it was a family matter. Now the town stood at the edge of something larger. If she returned and confirmed what the notebook suggested, he exhaled slowly. The church bell rang for evening prayer. Its sound rolled steady and familiar across Arroyo Seco. But beneath it, something else stirred. Anticipation, fear, hope. Inside the Villarreal house, Elena lay awake long after dark. Returning. She whispered the name into her pillow. Soladad. She did not know what the other girl would remember. She did not know whether the years had broken her or hardened her. But for the first time since she had found that hidden note behind the stove, Elena felt something different from dread. Possibility. Outside, the wind shifted. Far to the east along the road from Las Vegas, a carriage rolled slowly over uneven ground, carrying passengers who had once been labeled unstable. One of them watched the desert pass through tired eyes. And in Arroyo Seco crossing, the structure that had seemed immovable now carried a fracture no one could fully seal. Because when the past returned in flesh and bone, silence no longer belonged only to those who enforced it. Anywhere that isn't here, Elena said when the padlock broke. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the Villarreal house like a gunshot. Elena had been counting. 14 cracks in the ceiling. 14 breaths between footsteps. 14 ways to disappear without being noticed. But tonight, there had been no counting. Only the sudden scrape of metal against metal. The lock on her attic door had been added that afternoon. Isadora had called it precaution. Padre Tomas had called it protection. Elena had called it a sign. She sat on the edge of her cot when she heard voices below, louder than usual, sharper. Sheriff Salazar's voice carried first. You cannot confine her, he was saying. I am safeguarding her, Padre Tomas replied smoothly. The town is agitated. Rumors spread. She needs quiet. Behind a lock, Salazar demanded. Silence followed. Then the scrape again. Elena stood as the first strike hit the door. The impact shuddered through the frame and into her bones. Another strike. Wood split. Dust fell from the rafters. Her breath came fast and thin. Below, Isadora's voice rose in protest. This is outrageous. The third blow shattered the hinge. The door burst inward. Lantern light flooded the attic, blinding after days of dimness. Sheriff Salazar stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Behind him, Mateo Cruz filled the stairwell like a wall of iron, and further back, a thin older man in a worn brown habit watched silently Father Ignacio Herrera, newly arrived from the parish 30 miles west. Elena's body reacted before her mind did. She stepped backward. Salazar's eyes softened when he saw her. You're not in trouble, he said quietly. Mateo did not speak. His gaze swept the room, the cot, the crate, the empty space beneath the loose board. The absence of the notebook was not lost on him. Padre Tomas appeared behind them, his face composed despite the broken door. This is unnecessary, he said evenly. She is ill. I am not ill, Elena heard herself say. The words surprised her. They surprised everyone. Silence thickened the air. Salazar stepped into the room fully. Miss Alvarez, he said, voice steady. Were you placed here against your will? Elena looked from the sheriff to Padre Tomas. The priest's eyes were calm, almost gentle. A warning without movement. Her heart pounded so loudly she felt it in her throat. She saw Soladad's handwriting in her mind. He comes when the candles die. She saw her own ink, if I disappear. She swallowed. Yes, she said. The word fell heavy and final. Isidora gasped behind them. Padre Tomas did not move. You are confused, he said softly. Fear distorts memory. Elena's hands trembled at her sides. She looked at Mateo. His face was set in stone, but his eyes held something fierce and steady. Belief. The floorboards beneath her felt unstable, as if the entire house had shifted on its foundation. Anywhere that isn't here, Elena said when the padlock broke. Her voice was quiet but clear. Salazar nodded once. Then you'll leave with us, he said. Isidora stepped forward, her face flushed. She has nowhere to go. She will not remain here, Salazar replied. Padre Tomas's voice remained controlled. You are making a grave mistake, Sheriff. Perhaps Salazar answered. But I will not make it behind a locked door. Mateo stepped aside to clear the stair. Elena hesitated only a moment. The attic had been her prison. It had also been her witness. 14 cracks, 14 years of childhood reduced to ink and wood and fear. She crossed the threshold. The broken door lay splintered behind her. Each step down the stairs felt unreal. Her legs shook. She had imagined leaving 1,000 times. She had never imagined walking. The parlor below was crowded now. Jacinta Romero stood near the hearth, hands clasped tightly. Rosa Benali leaned against the wall, silent and watchful. Buckley hovered near the door, uneasy. The room smelled of dust, and something sharp, like a storm, had passed through. Elena reached the bottom step and paused. The house looked smaller from here, less certain. Salazar gestured toward the open door. Come, he said. She stepped into the plaza. Daylight struck her face. She had not realized how dim the attic had become until now. The town had gathered. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. She saw faces she had known since childhood. Faces that had nodded at Padre Tomas's sermons. Faces that had watched her scrub stone. Some looked away. Some stared openly. None stepped forward. Mateo remained beside her, but did not touch her. He did not need to. Salazar cleared his throat. Miss Alvarez will be staying elsewhere, he announced. Where Buckley asked. Rosa stepped forward. With me, she said. A ripple moved through the crowd. Padre Tomas emerged from the doorway behind them. He stood tall, composed, the image of authority. You are allowing hysteria to dictate justice, he said to Salazar. And you are mistaking control for care, the sheriff replied. The two men faced each other across the dust of the plaza. The church bell tower loomed above them. For a moment it felt as though the entire town held its breath. Elena did not look back at the house. She did not trust herself to. Rosa touched her elbow lightly. Come, she murmured. They crossed the plaza slowly. Every step felt like defiance. Behind them, Padre Tomas's voice carried once more. This will not end quietly, he said. Mateo did not turn. Nothing ever does, he replied. The trading post stood at the edge of town, just beyond the last cluster of adobe homes. It smelled of leather and herbs and wood smoke. Rosa closed the door behind them. Elena stood in the center of the small room, unsure where to place her hands. "You are safe here," Rosa said simply. The word sounded different from Isadora's version. Not ownership, promise. Elena's knees buckled slightly. She sank onto a wooden stool. The silence in the room was not suffocating. It was open. Matteo remained near the doorway. "You did well," he said quietly. Elena met his gaze. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "You stepped out," he said. She swallowed. "It felt like falling," she admitted. Matteo nodded once. Sometimes falling is the only way down from something too high. Outside, the plaza buzzed. Salazar remained near the church steps, speaking in low tones with Buckley and Deacon Herrera. Father Ignacio stood nearby, listening carefully. "We cannot ignore this," the priest from the western parish said. Buckley rubbed his temples. "And if Vargas arrives and confirms it," Salazar's jaw tightened, "then the truth won't fit in a locked room anymore." Back inside the trading post, Elena sat very still. Her hands rested in her lap. They no longer shook. She looked down at the faint lines where linen wraps had once cut into her skin. For the first time in 5 years, no one stood above her. No one hovered at the door. The quiet felt unfamiliar. Matteo stepped closer. "The notebook is safe," he said softly. Her eyes filled unexpectedly. "Did they read it?" she asked. "Yes." She inhaled slowly. "They believed it. They're deciding," he answered. The word held uncertainty. She nodded. "I don't want them deciding," she said. "I want them knowing." Matteo's expression hardened. "They will." Outside, the sun began to sink. The church bell rang again, steady and unchanged, but the sound felt different now, less certain. Because the door that had hidden truth lay broken on an attic floor. Because the girl who had counted cracks had stepped into light. Because somewhere on the eastern road, a carriage was drawing closer, carrying a woman who had once been called unstable. Elena stood slowly. She walked to the small window of the trading post and looked out at the town. Arroyo Seco Crossing looked the same as it had that morning. The same adobe walls, the same church steeple, the same narrow acequia, but she felt something beneath it all, something unsteady. Not collapse. Shift. She pressed her palm lightly against the glass. 14 cracks had once defined her ceiling. Now there was sky. And though fear still lingered in her bones, it no longer owned the room. Behind her, Matteo watched the line of her shoulders straighten. The structure had been forced open. And once a door was broken, it could not be mended without leaving a scar. In the fading light, the town began to understand that this would not be contained. Because a girl had walked out, and she had not walked alone. "He told me no one would believe me," Soladad said, standing in the plaza. He was almost right. The carriage rolled into Arroyo Seco Crossing, under a sky bleached pale by heat. Dust trailed behind it, like a fading memory settling into the grooves of the road and the cracks between adobe bricks. People had gathered long before it arrived. Word traveled faster than horses in a place this small. Women stood in clusters beneath shawls. Men leaned against fence posts and wagon wheels. Children were pulled close by anxious hands. Even those who claimed disinterest found reasons to linger in doorways. Elena stood beside Rosa Benali at the edge of the trading post porch. Her hands were steady, though her pulse felt like a second heartbeat inside her throat. Matteo stood several paces away, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to lose sight. Sheriff Salazar waited near the center of the plaza, hat in hand. Padre Tomas stood on the church steps, his posture unyielding, black cassock, stark against sun-warmed stone. The carriage door opened. A thin woman stepped down slowly, assisted by a young orderly from Las Vegas. Her braid was shorter than Elena remembered, her cheeks hollowed, But her eyes were the same. Soledad Vargas lifted her chin as her boots touched Arroyo Seco dust again. Silence fell, not the quiet of prayer, the quiet of anticipation. Her father stood near the well hat, twisting between his hands. He did not move toward her. The orderly cleared his throat. "Miss Vargas has been discharged to her parish as requested," he announced stiffly. "Further treatment deemed unnecessary." Unnecessary. The word cut sharp. Soledad scanned the crowd. Her gaze passed over Padre Tomas without lingering. It found Elena. Recognition flickered, not surprise. Recognition. Padre Tomas stepped forward first. "Soledad," he said warmly as though welcoming a prodigal child. "We have prayed for your return." Soledad did not bow her head. She did not step toward him. Instead, she looked past him to Sheriff Salazar. "Is there somewhere we can speak?" she asked. Her voice was thinner than it had been years ago, but it did not tremble. Salazar nodded. The council room. Buckley shifted uneasily, but said nothing. The crowd parted as Soledad walked through it. Elena felt her breath catch. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. She had never imagined how quiet it would be. Inside the general store's back chamber, the air felt heavy. The same table, the same lantern. Sheriff Salazar took his place at the head. Buckley and Deacon Herrera sat stiffly along one side. Father Ignacio Herrera stood near the wall, hands folded inside his sleeves. Padre Tomas remained standing. Mateo did not sit. He stood near the door, silent. Soledad took the empty chair at the end of the table. She folded her hands in her lap. The room waited. Salazar spoke first. "Miss Vargas," he said carefully, "we need to understand why you were admitted to Las Vegas." Soledad's eyes did not waver. "I was not ill," she said. The words fell clean. Buckley inhaled sharply. Padre Tomas's voice remained measured. "You were in distress," he said. "You remember how agitated you became." Soledad looked at him. "Yes," she said. "And why was that?" Salazar asked gently. She held the sheriff's gaze. "Because he came when the candles died," she said. The room seemed to tilt. Mateo felt his fists clench at his sides. Buckley swallowed audibly. Padre Tomas did not blink. "You were confused," he said softly. Soledad shook her head. "I was told I was confused," she replied. Her hands tightened in her lap. "He told me no one would believe me," Soledad said, standing in the plaza. He was almost right. She had not intended to stand. But the words lifted her. Her voice carried through the open doorway out into the plaza where the crowd leaned closer. Inside the room, Salazar did not interrupt. After the third time she continued, "I tried to tell my father." Her father's hat twisted harder in his hands outside. "He said I must have misunderstood," she said. "He said Padre Tomas would never." Her jaw tightened. "When I would not stop crying," she went on, "I was taken to Las Vegas." The silence deepened. Buckley shifted uncomfortably. Deacon Herrera stared at the tabletop. Padre Tomas's composure remained intact. "You were treated kindly," he said evenly. "Given rest." "I was given walls," Soledad replied. Her eyes burned now. "I was given silence." She looked directly at Salazar. "They asked me what I saw," she said. "I told them." They wrote hysteria. The word lingered bitterly in the air. Salazar's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Mateo glanced toward the plaza. Elena stood rigid, every word hitting her like an echo of her own ink. "So you are stating," Salazar said carefully, "that your admission was not medical necessity." "Yes." "And that the priest, Padre Tomas, stepped forward." "This is slander fueled by delusion," he said sharply. Father Ignacio moved then quietly but firmly. "Allow her to finish," he said. The authority in his voice was not loud, but it carried weight. Soledad did not look away from Padre Tomas. "You told me," she said slowly, "that obedience would save me." Her voice steadied further. It did not. The words struck harder than accusation. They stripped away pretense. Buckley's face had gone pale. Deacon Herrera's lips moved in silent prayer. Salazar stood slowly. "Until this matter is resolved," he said, "Padre Tomas will not exercise parish authority." A collective intake of breath filled the plaza. Padre Tomas's eyes flashed. "You overstep," he said. "I enforce order," Salazar replied. "You destroy it," Padre Tomas shot back. Father Ignacio stepped between them, calm and resolute. "No," he said. "Order built on silence is not order at all." Outside, the murmur of voices swelled. The church bell began to ring, slow, insistent. But no one moved toward the steps. Soledad sank back into her chair, exhaustion flickering across her face. Elena stepped forward from the porch at last. She crossed the plaza and entered the council room without being called. All eyes turned. She stood beside Soledad. The resemblance between them, though slight, felt undeniable. Shared stillness, shared endurance. Elena met Salazar's gaze. It was the same, she said quietly. The simplicity of it made it devastating. Padre Tomas looked between the two girls. For the first time, the certainty in his expression faltered. Only slightly, but enough. Salazar exhaled slowly. "This does not end here," he said. It was not a threat. It was acknowledgement. The structure had cracked, but it had not yet fallen. Outside, the crowd began to disperse in unsettled clusters. Some faces were tight with disbelief, others with dawning understanding. Rosa stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Soledad's shoulder. "You are not alone," she said. Mateo felt something loosen inside his chest. The ink had spoken. Now flesh had answered. But he also understood what Padre Tomas did. Power did not surrender quietly. As dusk began to lower over Arroyo Seco, Padre Tomas stood alone on the church steps. His silhouette cut sharp against the fading sky. The bell rang again. Fewer heads bowed this time. In the trading post that night, Elena sat beside Soledad. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Shared silence felt different from enforced silence. Outside, Sheriff Salazar stood beneath the cottonwoods by the acequia. He watched the water move steadily through its narrow channel. Truth had surfaced, but truth demanded consequence, and consequence would not come without resistance. Across the plaza, a shadow moved behind the church door. Padre Tomas was not finished. Not yet. And everyone in Arroyo Seco Crossing knew it. "You built a church," Sheriff Salazar said quietly. "You did not build a kingdom." The words did not echo. They settled. They settled in the council room, thick with dust and accusation. They settled in the plaza where the crowd waited. They settled in the hollow space beneath the church bell that had rung without certainty the night before. Padre Tomas stood before the table, hands clasped behind his back, as though still delivering a sermon. The lantern light cut across his face, dividing it cleanly, half shadow, half illumination. Sheriff Esteban Salazar did not raise his voice when he spoke. He did not need to. "You built a church," he repeated. "You did not build a kingdom." Buckley shifted uncomfortably beside him. Deacon Herrera avoided eye contact entirely, his gaze locked on the tabletop. Father Ignacio stood along the wall, silent but unyielding. Outside, the plaza hummed with waiting. Soledad and Elena sat together near the trading post porch. Rosa remained behind them, watchful. Mateo stood in the doorway of the council room, not crossing the threshold, but not retreating either. Padre Tomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You mistake testimony for truth," he said evenly. "You mistake fear for evidence. I have ink," Salazar replied. "I have spoken words, and I have two women whose stories align. Women who have influenced one another," Padre Tomas countered smoothly. "Grief spreads like infection." Salazar's eyes did not waver. "So does power," he said. Silence pressed inward. Buckley cleared his throat. "This is not merely about morality," he said, attempting steadiness. "It concerns parish leadership. Stability." "Stability," Mateo said from the doorway, "is not the same as righteousness." Buckley shot him a warning look. "This is council business," he snapped. "It is town business," Mateo answered calmly. Padre Tomas turned toward him. "You have inserted yourself into matters beyond your comprehension," he said. Mateo did not flinch. "I comprehend enough." Salazar raised a hand, cutting through the tension. "This is not about personality," he said. "It is about authority and harm." He looked directly at Padre Tomas. "Until the territorial office reviews these accusations," he continued, "you are suspended from parish authority." The word landed like a hammer strike. Suspended. Buckley inhaled sharply. Deacon Herrera whispered something under his breath. Padre Tomas remained upright. "You do not have the power," he said quietly. "I do," Salazar replied. He reached for a folded document on the table, a formal notice drafted that morning. "It is within my jurisdiction to suspend a cleric under investigation when credible testimony suggests abuse of authority." The room held its breath. Padre Tomas's gaze flicked briefly to Father Ignacio. "You would allow this?" he asked. Father Ignacio stepped forward at last. "I will oversee services temporarily," he said, "until matters are clarified." The phrasing was careful. It did not declare guilt. It acknowledged fracture. Outside, the murmurs grew louder. Word traveled quickly through thin adobe walls. Salazar signed the document. The scratch of pen against paper sounded louder than it should have. He slid it across the table. "You will surrender the parish ledger," he said. For the first time, a flash of something unguarded crossed Padre Tomas's face. Not fear. Anger. He did not argue. He removed a small key from his pocket and set it on the table. The metal clinked softly. "You will regret this," he said evenly. Salazar met his gaze. "If what they say is true," he replied, "we already regret enough." The council room door opened. The plaza came into view. Padre Tomas stepped out first. He did not hurry. He did not look at the crowd. He descended the church steps slowly, each movement deliberate. No one bowed their head. No one stepped aside in reverence. They stepped aside in uncertainty. The bell tower stood silent. Elena felt her knees weaken slightly. It had happened. Not complete justice. Not confession. But suspension. The man who had filled every corner of her world now stood without a pulpit. Soladad exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. Rosa squeezed her shoulder once. Mateo watched from the council doorway. The shift was visible. The invisible structure that had once felt immovable now bore cracks of its own. Padre Tomas stopped at the edge of the plaza. He turned at last. His eyes found Elena, then Soladad, then Mateo. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look carried promise. Or warning, perhaps both. He walked toward the Villarreal house without another word. Isadora stood at the threshold, pale and rigid. She opened the door. He entered. The door closed behind them. Inside the council room, Buckley sagged back into his chair. "This will divide the town," he muttered. "It already was," Salazar replied. Deacon Herrera rubbed his temples. "We must inform the territorial office immediately," he said. "I will draft the notice," Father Ignacio answered quietly. Salazar nodded, and the parish funds, Buckley asked. They remain frozen until review, Salazar said. The machinery of authority had shifted, but machinery did not break cleanly. Outside, the crowd dispersed in uneasy clusters. Some faces were tight with disbelief. Others carried dawning clarity. Jacinta approached Elena slowly. "I should have spoken sooner," she said. Elena shook her head faintly. "We were all quiet," she replied. Jacinta swallowed. "Not anymore," she said. Soladad looked toward the church steeple. "It feels strange," she admitted softly, "to stand here and not feel watched." Rosa gave a faint smile. "That will take time," she said. Mateo crossed the plaza toward them. "It's not over," he said quietly. Elena nodded. "I know." Her voice did not shake. Salazar emerged from the council room last. He paused near the acequia watching the water run. Father Ignacio joined him. "You understand what this invites," the older priest said. "Yes," Salazar answered. "Resistance. Yes." The acequia water flowed steadily, indifferent to human authority. Salazar exhaled. "Order built on silence is not order," he murmured. Father Ignacio inclined his head. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Arroyo Seco. Inside the Villarreal house, Padre Tomas stood at the study window. His jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. Isidora hovered nearby. "They cannot do this," she whispered. "They already have," he replied. His voice had lost none of its composure. "They believe testimony over position. They believe ink over rank," Isidora said bitterly. Padre Tomas turned from the window. "Belief is fragile," he said softly. "It can be redirected." Isidora watched him carefully. "And if the territorial office confirms suspension?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a leather-bound volume on his desk and began turning pages methodically. The parish ledger, records of land grants, water rights, tithes. Control did not reside solely in sermons. It lived in signatures. Outside, Elena walked slowly toward the trading post. The plaza felt different beneath her feet. Not lighter, just honest. She glanced once at the church steps where she had scrubbed stone for years. The steps were clean, but she no longer saw them as a measure of obedience. She saw them as evidence of endurance. Soladad walked beside her. Neither girl spoke. They did not need to. Behind them, the council had acted. Ahead of them, consequences waited. The sun slipped lower and the sky deepened to amber. The bell did not ring for evening prayer. No one had claimed the rope. The town stood in a pause it had never known before, suspended, like a breath drawn but not yet released. And beneath that breath, something else began to stir, quiet, patient, and determined not to retreat. "I will not run," Elena said. "I was never the one who should have left." The words came quietly, but they carried more weight than shouting ever could. They stood in the trading post just before dusk, the scent of dried herbs and leather heavy in the warm air. Rosa had just finished closing the shutters for the night. Soledad sat at the small wooden table, fingers wrapped around a tin cup she had barely touched. Father Ignacio stood near the doorway, hat in hand, his weathered face drawn with concern. "You have options," he said gently. "Santa Fe would welcome you. There are sisters there who could provide shelter. Distance can be mercy." Elena shook her head. "No," she said. Soledad glanced at her. "Santa Fe is far," Father Ignacio continued. "And this town, it may not be kind." "It never was," Elena replied. The older priest studied her carefully. "You are young," he said. You deserve a place without shadows. Elena's gaze drifted to the window where the church steeple rose against the fading sky. Those shadows belong to him, she said softly. Not to me. Rosa leaned back against the counter, arms folded. Leaving would not erase what happened, she added. No, Elena agreed. And staying will not undo it. But I will not run. She turned to Soladad. You were sent away, she said. I will not be. Soledad's jaw tightened. They told my father I needed quiet. She said, her voice steady but thin. They said distance would cure me. And did it? Rosa asked. Soledad's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. It taught me that silence is not peace. Father Ignacio exhaled slowly. You understand the consequences, he said. Elena nodded. Yes. The trading post fell quiet. Outside, Arroyo Seco moved in a different rhythm now. The church bell had not rung that evening. No one had claimed the rope. Inside the Villarreal house, Padre Tomas sat alone at his desk, the parish ledger open before him. The suspension had not stripped him of the building. Not yet. But the ledger was no longer entirely his. Water rights required signatures. Land grants required witnesses. The sheriff's notice had frozen access. Control had slipped, but it had not vanished. Isadora paced the parlor. They are turning, she whispered. You can see it in their faces. They are confused, he corrected calmly. Confusion is temporary. And if it isn't? He closed the ledger slowly. Belief can be redirected, he said again. Outside, Mateo stood by the acequia watching the water slide through its narrow channel. The irrigation gates had not been adjusted that day. No one had approached the church for instruction. Jacinta joined him quietly. She's staying, she said. I know, Mateo replied. Jacinta studied him. That makes this harder. Yes, but it also makes it honest, she added. Mateo nodded faintly. He did not fear the town's whispers. He feared retaliation. Suspension did not mean defeat. It meant pause. Inside the trading post, Soledad stood and crossed to the window. My father won't speak to me, she said. Elena stepped beside her. He's afraid, she replied. Of him, yes. Soledad's shoulders sagged slightly. He told me to forget, she said. He said it was God's will. Elena looked out at the plaza. No, she said quietly. It was his. The distinction mattered. Father Ignacio cleared his throat. I will assume temporary pastoral duties, he said. But I cannot promise how long the town will tolerate this. They will tolerate it, Rosa said firmly, because they have already seen too much. The words hung in the air, seen too much. The truth had not been whispered behind closed doors. It had been spoken in the plaza. That mattered. Elena turned back to the room. I will not hide, she said. I will not leave in the night. I will walk through that plaza every day. Her voice steadied further as she continued. I was never the one who should have left. Rosa's eyes softened. You'll stay here, she said, for now. Elena nodded. I'll work, she added. I won't be a burden. You never were, Rosa replied quietly. Across town, Buckley stood near the general store, arguing in low tones with Deacon Herrera. This has gone too far, Buckley muttered. We cannot have open rebellion. It is not rebellion, Deacon Herrera replied. It is reckoning. Buckley glanced toward the Villarreal house. He will not accept this quietly, no, Deacon Herrera admitted. Then what? The older man hesitated. Then we must choose what kind of town we are. The question lingered. Later that evening, Sheriff Salazar knocked at the trading post door. Rosa opened it. He removed his hat before stepping inside. I need to know, he said, looking at Elena, if you intend to press formal charges when the territorial office arrives. The room grew still. Elena's heart beat heavily. "Yes," she said. Salazar nodded once. "You understand, that means testimony. Publicly, yes." Soledad stepped forward. "I will testify," she said. Salazar looked at her carefully. "You are certain?" She held his gaze. "He told me no one would believe me," she said softly. "I want him to hear otherwise." The sheriff inclined his head. "Then we proceed." When he left, the trading post felt smaller and larger at once. Smaller because the path ahead had narrowed. Larger because it was clear. Night settled slowly over Arroyo Seco. The church stood dark. No candlelight flickered in its windows. Elena lay on a narrow cot Rosa had prepared for her. The ceiling above her was smooth. No cracks. She found herself counting anyway. Not from fear, from habit. 14. The number came automatically. She exhaled and stopped. No more counting to survive. In the Villarreal house, Padre Tomas stood in the empty sanctuary. He had entered through the side door after dusk alone. The pews sat silent. The altar stood untouched. He walked to the center aisle and rested his hand on the back of a pew. They believed ink, he thought. They believed trembling voices. He looked up at the cross above the altar. Belief could be bent. It had always bent. He turned and exited quietly. Across town, Mateo sat at his forge, the iron lockbox open before him. He removed Elena's notebook and ran his fingers over the cover. She is staying. The thought filled him with both pride and dread. He closed the box again and locked it. If she was staying, he would not leave either. The night wind moved through the cottonwoods along the acequia. Water continued its steady flow, unbothered by human authority. In the trading post, Elena lay awake. She did not fear the attic. She feared what standing in the open would invite. But fear did not feel the same anymore. It no longer paralyzed. It sharpened. Beside her, Soladad slept lightly, breath shallow but steady. 2 witnesses, 2 voices. The town would have to decide what to do with them, and for the first time since she had found the hidden note behind the stove, Elena did not imagine herself vanishing. She imagined herself rooted. In the morning, she would cross the plaza in daylight, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone who had chosen to remain. And that choice, she understood, would demand something from everyone else as well. "You think removing my collar removes my voice," Padre Tomas said. "I have shaped this town longer than you have worn that badge." The words carried across the sanctuary like a sermon-turned blade. The church was full for the first time since the suspension. Not because a bell had called them, because tension had. Sheriff Salazar stood near the back pew, hat in hand, but posture firm. Father Ignacio occupied the pulpit temporarily, though he had not begun the service. Buckley and Deacon Herrera sat stiffly in the front row. Rosa and Jacinta stood along the side wall. Elena and Soledad entered together. No one told them not to. Whispers trailed behind them as they moved down the center aisle. The wood floor creaked under their steps, the sound loud in the hushed room. At the altar, Padre Tomas stood without vestments. No collar, no stole, suspended, but not silent. "You think removing my collar removes my voice?" he said, turning toward Salazar. "I have shaped this town longer than you have worn that badge." Salazar did not approach the altar. He remained where he stood. "This is not your service," he said calmly. "It is my church," Padre Tomas replied. "It belongs to the parish." "And who shaped that parish?" he pressed. His voice was not raised, but it carried authority that had been cultivated for years, for decades. Men shifted uneasily in the pews. Women avoided looking directly at the altar. Padre Tomas stepped down from the chancel, moving into the aisle. "You bring accusation," he said, his gaze sweeping over the congregation. "You elevate doubt above devotion." He turned toward Elena and Soladad. "You allow hysteria to become law." Elena felt her spine stiffen. Soledad's fingers tightened around the edge of the pew. Father Ignacio moved from the pulpit at last. "Padre," he said gently but firmly, "this is not the place." "It is exactly the place," Padre Tomas replied. He faced the congregation fully. "For years I have baptized your children, buried your fathers, blessed your fields." He gestured toward the door. "And now you listen to ink," the word dripped with disdain. A murmur ran through the pews. Buckley stood abruptly. "This has gone far enough," he said. Padre Tomas's eyes flashed. "Has it?" he asked. His gaze locked onto Elena. "Tell them," he said. The command was sharp. "Tell them why you never spoke until that blacksmith filled your head." The accusation landed like a thrown stone. All eyes shifted. Elena felt the weight press against her ribs. She could remain silent. She could step back. The old instinct surged briefly. Hide. Wait. Endure. But that instinct no longer ruled her. She stepped into the aisle. "I wrote long before I ever spoke to him," she said. Her voice did not tremble. Padre Tomas tilted his head slightly. "And why did you not bring these claims sooner? Because you told me no one would believe me," she replied. The echo of Soledad's words was not lost on anyone. Padre Tomas's jaw tightened. "You misunderstand spiritual discipline for harm," he said smoothly. "Correction is not cruelty." Soledad stood then. "You called it correction," she said quietly. Her voice was thin but unbreakable. "You said obedience would save me." The sanctuary seemed to constrict around the exchange. Father Ignacio stepped between them and the altar. "This is not a courtroom," he said. No Salazar answered from the back. "But it is where truth was hidden." Padre Tomas turned sharply. "You presume guilt," he said. "I presume investigation," Salazar replied. The tension thickened. Buckley looked torn between outrage and uncertainty. Deacon Herrera bowed his head, whispering something no one else could hear. Padre Tomas lifted his chin. "You suspend me," he said. "You freeze parish funds. You allow slander to spread." He gestured toward the pews. "And you stand silent while the foundations of your faith are dismantled." A flicker of fear passed through the congregation. Faith and authority had been intertwined here for years. To question one felt like unraveling the other. Elena felt it too. The doubt, the tremor. She took another step forward. "You built fear into faith," she said. The words came before she could soften them. "You told us obedience was holiness." She swallowed. "But obedience to harm is not holy." Silence fell hard. Padre Tomas's composure cracked for the briefest moment. Then it returned. "You are young," he said dismissively. "So were we," Soledad answered. The simplicity of it struck deeper than argument. Salazar moved a few steps down the aisle. "The territorial office arrives in 3 days," he said evenly. "Until then, you will refrain from public address." Padre Tomas let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think that piece of paper binds me?" he asked. Salazar did not answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew another folded document. A temporary injunction. Signed. Sealed. "Violation of suspension will result in arrest pending review," he said. The word arrest rippled through the sanctuary. Padre Tomas stared at the paper. "You would chain a priest, I would uphold the law," Salazar replied. The air felt electric. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Rosa stepped forward from the side wall. We have lived with chains long enough, she said quietly. The phrase settled among them. Chains. Mateo stood at the church doorway, his silhouette cutting against the sunlight. He had not entered until now. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone shifted something in the room. Padre Tomas looked from one face to another. The unwavering loyalty he had once relied upon was fractured. Not gone, but fractured. You are mistaken if you think removing me restores order, he said coldly. Order built on silence was never order, Father Ignacio replied. The exchange ended not with a shout, but with stillness. Padre Tomas stepped back toward the altar. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He turned and exited through the sacristy door without another word. The sanctuary remained quiet long after he left. No one rushed to follow him. No one spoke immediately. Elena felt her breath leave her slowly. The confrontation had not broken him, but it had revealed him. Salazar folded the injunction carefully. We will proceed lawfully, he said. Father Ignacio nodded. Service did not resume that morning. People filed out in small, uncertain groups. Outside, the plaza felt different again, less tense, more exposed. Elena and Soladad stepped into the sunlight together. The church bell remained still. Mateo joined them near the steps. He's not finished, he said quietly. No, Elena agreed. Her voice held no fear, only awareness. Across the plaza, Padre Tomas stood briefly in the shadow of the Villarreal house before disappearing inside. Isidora closed the door behind him. Inside the study window, curtains were drawn. The ledger still rested on the desk. Suspension had not erased memory. It had not erased loyalty among certain families. Power did not dissolve in a single confrontation. It retreated, regrouped. In the trading post that evening, Rosa set extra candles on the table. We stay together, she said. Father Ignacio would draft additional statements. Salazar would prepare the file for the territorial office. Mateo would guard the notebook. Elena sat at the table, pen in hand. For the first time, she wrote without hiding. June 18th. He spoke without a collar. She paused. The ink flowed smoothly, but the town did not bow. She set the pen down. Outside, the sky darkened. The church stood silent. The confrontation had drawn lines no one could ignore. And beneath the quiet, something else moved, slow, deliberate, and inevitable. Because power challenged in daylight does not vanish quietly in the dark. It waits. And so did they. They set the forge on fire, Diego gasped. They're saying it was an accident. The smoke was still rising when Elena stepped into the plaza. It curled upward in thick gray ribbons from the direction of Mateo's forge, staining the pale morning sky. The smell reached her before the sight burnt wood, scorched leather, something metallic and bitter beneath it. She didn't wait for Rosa to speak. She ran. Soladad followed close behind. By the time they reached the forge, half the town had gathered in a jagged circle. Buckets lay overturned near the trough. The doors of the forge hung crooked, blackened, and warped. The roof had partially collapsed inward, beams charred and splintered. Mateo stood in the center of the ruined sleeves, rolled hands black with soot. Sheriff Salazar stood nearby, jaw-tight eyes scanning the perimeter. They set the forge on fire. Diego gasped. They're saying it was an accident. The boy stood near Elena, chest heaving, face streaked with ash. What happened? Elena asked, her voice catching. Started before dawn, Mateo said without looking at her. His voice was steady but too calm. By the time Diego saw the smoke, it had already taken the roof. So it wasn't contained, Soledad asked softly. Mateo shook his head once. Oil-soaked rags, Salazar said grimly. Behind the coal bin. Not accident. Elena's gaze dropped instinctively to the place where the iron lockbox had once rested beneath the workbench. The bench was gone, collapsed. Ash and twisted iron lay where wood had stood. Her breath hitched. Mateo saw it. It wasn't there, he said quietly. She looked up sharply. What I moved it last night, he said. To the stable. Relief surged so suddenly she had to steady herself against a fence post. Salazar knelt near the charred doorway examining the ground. Boot prints, he muttered. 2 sets. Buckley approached hesitantly, hat clutched in both hands. This is unfortunate, he said weakly. Mateo straightened slowly. Unfortunate, he repeated. Buckley swallowed. I meant tragic. Elena turned toward the Villarreal house instinctively. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn. Smoke from the forge drifted faintly across its roofline. Padre Tomas did not appear. He will deny it, Rosa said quietly behind them. Salazar stood. Unless I have proof, denial is enough, he replied. Mateo wiped ash from his hands onto his trousers. They want me gone, he said. They want the ink gone, Elena corrected. Her voice steadied as she spoke. Mateo met her gaze. Yes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces held sympathy. Others held unease. Jacinta stepped forward with a blanket and draped it over a smoldering beam. They're afraid, she said under her breath. Of what, Buckley asked sharply. Of losing control, she replied without looking at him. Salazar surveyed the damage again. I will investigate, he said, and in the meantime Mateo asked. The sheriff hesitated. You can't work here, he admitted. The truth hung heavy. The forge had not only been Mateo's livelihood, it had been his ground, his anchor. Elena stepped closer to the charred remains. The anvil stood untouched in the center of the ruin, blackened but intact. Iron survives. She placed her hand lightly on its cool surface. They burned wood, she said, not iron. Mateo watched her. The faintest flicker of something steadied in his expression. Across the plaza, the Villarreal door opened at last. Padre Tomas stepped out. He paused at the top of the steps, observing the smoke. He did not hurry. He did not appear startled. Instead, he descended slowly, hands clasped loosely behind his back. What has happened? He asked mildly. Mateo's jaw tightened visibly. Fire, Salazar said. How terrible, Padre Tomas replied. His eyes moved over the ruin, lingering briefly on the anvil. No one was harmed, he asked. No, Rosa answered sharply. That is a blessing, he said. Elena stepped forward before she could stop herself. Is it, she asked. He looked at her. Calm, unshaken. You presume much, he said quietly. She held his gaze. You warned us it wouldn't end quietly. And now you blame me for chaos, he replied. Salazar stepped between them. That's enough. Padre Tomas inclined his head slightly. I will pray for restoration, he said. Mateo's laugh was low and humorless. Keep your prayers, he said. The words were not shouted. They cut clean. The tension tightened like a pulled wire. Buckley cleared his throat again. We cannot allow vigilante accusations, he said. No one said vigilante, Salazar replied evenly. But arson is a crime. He turned to the crowd. If anyone saw movement before dawn, speak now. No one did. The silence was familiar. Elena felt it like a weight pressing at her shoulders. Silence again. Different form. Same function. She looked at the faces around her. Men who had once nodded during sermons. Women who had scrubbed pews beside her. Children who had played in the plaza unaware. They burned it to scare us, she said softly. The words carried further than she intended. To remind us what they can take. Soledad stepped beside her. Then we rebuild it, she said. The simplicity startled even Mateo. With what Buckley asked, with hands, Rosa replied. Mateo looked at the ruin again. The roof was gone, the door charred, but the anvil remained. The water trough stood intact. The stable still held tools. He exhaled slowly. They can burn wood, he repeated. Not iron. Salazar glanced toward the Villarreal house. The door had closed again. They're escalating, he said quietly to Mateo. I know. And the territorial office arrives tomorrow. The timing was not lost on anyone. Burn the forge, undermine the witness, unsettle the town before officials step into it. Mateo's eyes darkened. They think destruction will make us hesitate, he said. Elena stepped closer to him. It won't, she said. He looked at her. The ash in the air clung to her hair and shawl. She did not brush it away. The crowd began to thin, slowly, unsettled and unsure. Jacinta and Rosa remained. Diego hovered near the stable, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. Salazar lingered a moment longer. I'll post a deputy tonight, he said. Mateo nodded, and if nothing is proven, he asked. Salazar did not answer immediately. Then it becomes about endurance, he said at last. The word settled. Endurance. Elena looked at the anvil again. It stood in the center of ruin, immovable. She understood something then. The fire had not been meant only to destroy. It had been meant to test. Across town, inside the Villarreal house, Padre Tomas stood at the study window watching smoke dissipate. Isidora paced behind him. They suspect, she whispered. Suspicion without proof is noise, he replied. And if the territorial office sides with them, he did not turn. They will not. His voice was calm. Too calm. Outside, Mateo gathered what tools he could salvage. Rosa fetched water. Jacinta brought nails. Soledad lifted a half-burned beam with shaking hands. Elena stood beside Mateo. I will not run, she said again. He nodded once. Neither will I. The smoke thinned gradually, leaving behind the smell of char and something sharper. Not defeat, defiance. As dusk began to settle, the blackened frame of the forge cast a jagged shadow across the dirt. The anvil remained at its center. Tomorrow officials would arrive to examine ink and testimony. Tonight the town would sit with the smell of fire in its lungs. And those who believed silence could be enforced through fear would learn something else. Wood burns quickly. Iron waits. And in the quiet after flame, what remains is harder than before. Truth does not need a steeple, Father Ignacio said. It only needs daylight. The territorial carriage arrived at mid-morning, its wheels cutting clean tracks through the ash-streaked dust of Arroyo Seco crossing. No bell rang to greet it. No banner marked the moment. But the entire town knew. Two officials stepped down, one, a thin man in a gray suit, with wire spectacles. The other, broader, sun-worn, carrying a leather case. They introduced themselves simply Representative Calder from the Territorial Office and Magistrate Henry Lowe. Sheriff Salazar met them at the edge of the plaza. The burned skeleton of the forge stood behind him like testimony carved into wood. We appreciate your prompt arrival, Salazar said. Calder nodded, eyes already scanning the town. We received your report, he replied. Suspension of clerical authority, allegations of coercion and abuse, destruction of property. His gaze lingered on the forge. Convenient timing, Magistrate Lowe muttered. Salazar did not respond. The council room filled once more, but this time the air felt different, less speculative, more formal. Father Ignacio stood near the wall, hands folded. Buckley and Deacon Herrera sat rigidly at the table. Padre Tomas entered last. He wore no collar, but he carried himself as though he still did. Elena and Soladad sat side by side at the far end. Mateo stood behind them near the doorway. The iron lockbox rested at his feet. Calder removed a sheaf of papers from his case. "We will proceed in order," he said. Testimony began. Soledad spoke first. Her voice wavered at the edges but did not collapse. She described nights, whispers, hands that did not bless. Elena followed. Her words were quieter but exact. Dates aligned, details overlapped, ink became flesh. Calder asked careful questions. Magistrate Lowe listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. When they were finished, Calder turned to Padre Tomas. "You deny these accusations?" he asked. "I do," Padre Tomas replied evenly. "You claim fabrication, I claim misinterpretation," he said. Magistrate Lowe lifted his head. "Misinterpretation of forced confinement?" he asked. Padre Tomas's expression remained controlled. "I acted in pastoral care." "And the sanatorium admission?" Calder pressed. "Medical counsel," he answered. Calder consulted a document from Las Vegas. Dr. Whitlock indicates admission was based solely on clerical recommendation. The room shifted. Padre Tomas did not blink. He trusted my judgment. And now Lowe asked. Silence. Mateo bent slightly and lifted the iron lockbox onto the table. The metallic thud echoed in the room. Calder raised an eyebrow. "What is this record?" Mateo said. He unlocked the box. Elena watched as her notebook emerged once more into light. Calder accepted it carefully. He turned the pages slowly. The room held its breath. Page after page. Dates, consistency, specificity. He passed it to Lowe. The magistrate read longer. When he looked up, his expression had shifted. "You wrote this continuously?" he asked Elena. "Yes. For 5 years, yes. Without alteration. Yes." Lowe nodded once. Padre Tomas's composure thinned at the edges. "Diaries prove nothing," he said. "Patterns do," Calder replied. Silence followed. Outside, townspeople gathered once more waiting. The burned forge stood visible through the window. Calder closed the notebook gently. "We will deliberate," he said. They stepped outside. The sun was high. The plaza shimmered faintly in the heat. Elena remained seated. Her hands rested in her lap. They did not shake. Soledad's fingers intertwined with hers briefly. Mateo stood still, jaw tight. Father Ignacio exhaled slowly. Time stretched thin. Finally, Calder and Lowe returned. The air in the room shifted as they entered. Calder spoke first. "Effective immediately, Padre Tomas Villarreal is permanently removed from parish authority, pending formal ecclesiastical review." The words struck clean. Buckley closed his eyes briefly. Deacon Herrera whispered a prayer. Calder continued. "Given corroborated testimony and documented coercion, we recommend criminal proceedings under territorial law." The phrase hung heavy. Criminal proceedings. Padre Tomas stood very still. For a moment it seemed as though he might argue. Instead, he lifted his chin. "You allow hysteria to dismantle faith," he said quietly. "No," Father Ignacio replied. "We allow truth to refine it." Magistrate Lowe stepped forward. "Padre Tomas Villarreal, you are required to surrender yourself pending investigation." Sheriff Salazar moved beside him. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Isidora's gasp from the doorway cut sharp through the silence. Padre Tomas did not resist. He removed a ring from his finger, a simple silver band bearing the parish seal, and placed it on the table. "Faith will outlast this," he said. "Faith might," Elena answered softly. "Control won't." For the first time, he looked directly at her without composure. Then it returned. Salazar escorted him toward the door. No chains. But the weight of consequence hung visible. Outside, the plaza fell silent as they emerged. No one cheered. No one wept. They watched. As the man who had once commanded their obedience stepped into the territorial carriage, the door shut. The wheels turned. Dust rose again. This time it carried departure. When the carriage disappeared down the road, the town did not move immediately. It felt as though something had been holding their breath for years. And now, release. Father Ignacio stepped onto the church steps. He did not raise his voice. Truth does not need a steeple, he said. It only needs daylight. The words carried, not as accusation, as acknowledgement. Elena stood in the plaza, sunlight full on her face. No attic, no locked door, no shadow leaning over her shoulder. The forge remained blackened behind her, but Mateo had already begun clearing beams. Rosa carried water. Jacinta brought lumber from her shed. Diego held nails in a trembling fist. Soladad stood beside Elena. "We stayed," she said quietly. "Yes," Elena replied. They watched as Mateo positioned a new support beam against the anvil's side. Iron weighted. Wood could be replaced. Salazar returned to the center of the plaza. "Rebuilding starts tomorrow," he said. "It started today," Rosa corrected. A faint smile tugged at the sheriff's mouth. The church bell remained silent. No one reached for the rope. Not yet. Elena walked slowly toward the ruins of the forge. She ran her hand over the anvil once more. It felt solid, unmoved by flame. She turned toward the trading post where she had slept without counting cracks. The ceiling there was smooth, but she no longer needed to measure safety by absence of fracture. She measured it by presence. Presence of voices. Presence of witnesses. Presence of daylight. As dusk began to settle, Arroyo Seco crossing did not feel healed. Healing would take time. Trust would not return in a single verdict. But the structure that had once demanded silence had been named, and naming changed things. Elena looked up at the open sky. No steeple defined it. No roof enclosed it. Just space and breath, and the steady rhythm of a town learning what it meant to stand without fear. The lesson we can take from this story is that silence may protect us for a season, but truth protects us for a lifetime. Even when authority feels untouchable, steady voices spoken calmly and consistently can shift the ground beneath it. For those who have lived long enough to see both harm and healing, this is a reminder that courage does not have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it is simply the decision to stay to speak and to stand beside someone who cannot stand alone. In the end, communities are not preserved by avoiding discomfort, but by choosing honesty over fear even when it costs something.